At first, there is almost nothing to see. The boat has stopped over water so clear that the sunlight seems to continue far below the surface, fading gradually from turquoise into blue. A few small fish move beneath the hull, ripples pass across the sea. Then somebody points toward a shadow that does not seem to belong there. It is still some distance away, and for several seconds its size is difficult to judge. There is no reef beside it, no rock, no familiar object against which the mind can make a comparison. The shape simply grows larger. A broad head appears first, followed by an immense body covered in pale spots and stripes. The tail moves slowly from side to side. It does not seem to be swimming with any urgency, yet the distance between the animal and the boat disappears surprisingly quickly. By the time it passes underneath, the people above are no longer looking at a dark shape in the water. They are looking down at the largest living fish on Earth. And almost everything about that description creates the wrong expectation. Whale shark. The name sounds like a contradiction because it is one. It is not a whale. Despite reaching dimensions that overlap with some whales, and despite feeding in a way that seems far more familiar among the great filter-feeding mammals of the ocean, it is a shark, Rhincodon typus, the sole living member of its family, breathing through gills, supported by a skeleton made principally of cartilage rather than bone, carrying the basic anatomical inheritance of a lineage very different from whales. Yet if all you knew about sharks came from their reputation, a whale shark might appear to have taken the entire idea of being a shark and moved in the opposite direction. Its head can be enormously broad. Its mouth opens across the front of the face. Its body may weigh many tons, and instead of using that size to pursue large animals, it spends much of its feeding life collecting prey that can be astonishingly small: zooplankton, crustaceans, fish eggs, and other concentrated marine organisms. Whale sharks can also consume small schooling fish and other larger prey items when circumstances allow, but the basic strategy remains one of filtration rather than tearing apart large victims. This is one of those rare animals whose real biology seems less believable than the version we might have invented. The largest fish alive survives not by dominating the ocean's largest prey, but by finding moments when tiny life becomes abundant enough to support a giant. From the surface, however, none of that complexity is obvious. What people usually see is calmness. A whale shark moving near the surface can appear almost effortless. A diver may kick hard merely to remain beside an animal whose tail seems to move in slow, measured sweeps. Its mouth may open as it feeds. Water disappears inside and leaves through the gill region. Remoras may travel with it. Small fishes sometimes gather around the body. Sunlight makes the pale spot pattern stand out against the darker skin until the entire animal resembles something painted with hundreds of irregular stars. That image has become the public face of the species. Whale sharks beside snorkelers. Whale sharks beneath boats. Whale sharks feeding close to tropical coastlines. Whale sharks appearing predictably enough at certain places that entire tourism industries have developed around the possibility of seeing them. It creates an understandable illusion that we know these animals well. After all, mystery usually belongs to creatures that hide. Animals buried beneath sediment, living inside caves, occupying trenches several kilometers below the surface, or surviving in forests where humans almost never encounter them. A whale shark seems to offer none of those advantages. It can be gigantic. It sometimes swims in clear surface water. Individuals can return to well-known feeding areas. Their markings are so distinctive that researchers can identify particular sharks from photographs taken years apart. An animal like that should be difficult to lose. And yet losing whale sharks is one of the things humans do remarkably well. A shark can spend days or weeks in an area where boats encounter it repeatedly. Researchers may photograph it, measure it, attach a tracking device, and record where it feeds. Then the conditions change. The food disperses. The animal leaves. Beyond the coast, the ocean expands in every direction, and the advantage shifts immediately from observer to shark. Modern tagging has begun revealing just how misleading the familiar surface image can be. Whale sharks are not confined to the bright upper layer in which most people meet them. Tagged animals have demonstrated extensive vertical movements, repeatedly descending hundreds of meters and, in some studies, beyond 1 kilometer into the ocean. Their subsurface behavior was largely inaccessible before archival and satellite technologies began recording where they traveled after disappearing beneath the visible world. So the whale shark we photograph near the surface may represent only a brief chapter of that animal's day, season, or year. That changes the question. The mystery is no longer simply, where do whale sharks live? We know they occur widely through tropical and warm temperate oceans. We know many places where they appear seasonally. We know regions where predictable feeding opportunities bring them together. We have decades of observations, photographs, and tracking data. The more interesting question is, what are they doing during all the time we cannot see them? And once scientists began asking that question seriously, other gaps appeared. Consider size. Whale sharks are routinely described with astonishing maximum lengths, and old accounts contain claims of animals so enormous that they have become almost inseparable from the mythology surrounding the species. There is no doubt that exceptionally large whale sharks exist, and that the species reaches dimensions unmatched by any other living fish. But determining the true upper limit is more difficult than repeating the largest number ever printed. A giant animal swimming beneath a boat is surprisingly difficult to measure accurately. Water distorts perspective. A moving shark rarely presents itself beside a calibrated ruler. Eyewitness estimates tend to become less reliable as animals become larger, because most people simply do not have everyday experience judging the length of a fish comparable to a bus. Historical records also vary enormously in their quality. For that reason, modern researchers increasingly rely on methods such as laser photogrammetry, standardized photography, and repeated measurements of known individuals rather than accepting every extraordinary size claim at face value. Scientific literature and conservation assessments recognize whale sharks approaching roughly the high teens in meters at the extreme end, while many animals encountered at famous aggregation sites are considerably smaller. That distinction matters because the biggest whale sharks are not simply enlarged versions of the juveniles people commonly encounter. Their absence from many familiar locations is itself part of the mystery. At some major aggregation sites, researchers repeatedly encounter young males. Large mature females can be much harder to find. Newborn whale sharks are rarer still. We know this species must reproduce somewhere across its enormous range, yet some of the most important events in its life remain among the least frequently observed. Where do they mate? Where do pregnant females spend their time? Where are the places in which the smallest whale sharks begin their lives? Even today, those questions are not answered with the completeness we might expect for the world's largest fish. The Florida Museum notes that whale shark nursery grounds remain unresolved despite the species' extraordinary size and visibility. There is something almost backwards about the situation. Humans can stand on a boat and watch a whale shark feeding only a few meters away. We can photograph the pattern on its body. We can collect genetic material. We can attach instruments capable of recording depth and temperature. We can compare sightings across years and across borders. We can watch the animal vanish into water that appears perfectly empty after it leaves. And still, the complete life of that same shark remains beyond us. Part of the reason is scale. Not the scale of the animal, but the scale of the world it inhabits. A whale shark does not experience the ocean as a collection of famous dive sites. It encounters fronts where different bodies of water meet, patches of plankton created by currents, spawning events that may last only briefly, deep layers where temperature and prey change with depth, coastlines separated by enormous expanses of open water. Places that seem unrelated on our maps can be connected by the movements of a single animal. Even its food complicates the story. The ocean is not equally productive everywhere. Tiny prey can be spread so thinly that filtering it would barely repay the energy required to swim. Then currents converge, fish spawn, plankton bloom or biological conditions align, and suddenly an apparently empty patch of sea becomes rich enough to attract some of the largest mouths on the planet. The whale shark must somehow navigate between these temporary opportunities. That means its size, its feeding system, its movements, and even the places where humans encounter it are parts of the same problem. This animal is enormous because of a particular way of making a living. That way of making a living depends on understanding an ocean whose resources appear and disappear. Following those resources can carry the shark away from the coast, down through the water column, and beyond the range of ordinary observation. The familiar animal beneath the tourist boat is therefore real, but incomplete. We see the spots and think we recognize it. We see the giant mouth and think we understand how it feeds. We watch its slow movement and imagine a simple life spent cruising warm surface waters. But somewhere beyond that encounter are decades of growth, journeys that can span enormous distances, dives into darkness, missing adults, scarcely observed newborns, reproductive events scientists almost never witness, and stretches of life for which a satellite signal may provide the only evidence that the animal was ever there. To understand why all of those pieces belong to the same creature, we first have to answer something even more fundamental. Long before there were research boats, satellite tags, or divers waiting in tropical water, evolution produced a shark, unlike almost every expectation the word creates. An animal that could become larger than every other fish alive, while building its existence around food so small that much of it would pass unnoticed through a person's hand. And that transformation, from shark to giant, did not happen by simply making an ordinary predator bigger. The transformation was not a straight line from hunter to giant. Evolution rarely works that neatly. There was no moment when an ancestral shark stopped pursuing prey and began an inevitable march toward becoming the largest fish in the sea. What happened instead was a series of changes unfolding across millions of years, each useful in the environment in which it appeared, eventually producing an animal whose way of life now seems almost contradictory. Whale sharks belong to the cartilaginous fishes, the great branch of vertebrates that includes sharks, rays, and chimeras. Their skeletons are built primarily from cartilage rather than the heavily mineralized bone found in most fishes, and their ancestry reaches deep into the history of vertebrate life. But calling the whale shark an ancient fish can easily give the wrong impression. It is not some unchanged survivor carried intact from a prehistoric ocean. Sharks have continued evolving, diversifying into hundreds of species that occupy almost every marine environment, from shallow coral reefs to water thousands of meters deep. Somewhere within that enormous radiation, one lineage took a particularly unusual route. Today, Rhincodontypus stands alone. It is the only living species in the family Rhincodontidae, and it belongs to the order Orectolobiformes, the carpet sharks. That relationship produces one of the first surprises in its family tree. The world's largest living fish is not especially close to the great white, mako, or other fast predatory sharks that its size might bring to mind. Its broader evolutionary neighborhood includes animals such as nurse sharks, bamboo sharks, and wobbegongs, many of them bottom-associated species whose appearance and lifestyle could hardly seem more different from a whale shark crossing the open sea. Size alone, therefore, tells us very little about how a shark arrived at its present form. There have been gigantic predatory sharks, including extinct species equipped with enormous cutting teeth, but the whale shark reached giant size through another ecological route entirely. To understand that route, it helps to look at the only other living sharks that have done something broadly similar. There are just 3 living species of filter-feeding shark: the whale shark, the basking shark, and the megamouth. Place them side by side, and the similarity seems obvious. All 3 abandon dependence on capturing large individual prey and instead exploit concentrations of much smaller organisms suspended in the water. Yet their family histories show that this solution did not arise only once and then pass down to all 3. Filter feeding appears to have evolved independently in these separate shark lineages. The basking shark belongs among the lamniform sharks, a group containing great whites and makos. The rarely seen megamouth also belongs to the lamniforms, although its own lineage is distinct. The whale shark comes from the carpet shark branch. Evolution arrived at versions of the same basic answer more than once. That is important, because it tells us something about the ocean itself. Filter feeding is not an evolutionary curiosity that happened once by chance. Under the right conditions, it is such an effective way to exploit marine food that completely different animals have repeatedly converged upon it. The same pattern becomes even more striking if we leave sharks behind. Manta and devil rays filter small organisms from seawater. Some of the largest whales ever to exist do the same. A blue whale and a whale shark are separated by an enormous evolutionary distance. One is a warm-blooded mammal that breathes air, gives birth to live young that drink milk, and carries a skeleton of bone. The other is a fish breathing through gills, with a cartilaginous skeleton and a reproductive biology we are still trying to piece together. Yet both became giants while feeding surprisingly low on the food web. Their similarity is not inheritance from a recent common giant ancestor. It is convergence, different evolutionary histories encountering a similar ecological opportunity. At first, this seems backwards. A large body requires a great deal of energy. The intuitive strategy for supporting one might seem to be eating large prey. Why build an animal weighing many tons only to feed it copepods, fish eggs, and other organisms that may be measured in millimeters? The answer lies in the difference between the size of an individual prey item and the amount of food available in a patch of ocean. One copepod is almost nothing to a whale shark. Millions concentrated together are something very different. A predatory shark pursuing individual fish has to find them, chase them, capture them, and repeat the process. A filter feeder can exploit an entire concentration at once. When prey becomes dense enough, every mouthful of water contains food. The animal does not need each prey item to be large. It needs the total return from processing the water to exceed the cost of finding and filtering it. That condition is not present everywhere. Most seawater would be a terrible meal. Even productive oceans contain huge volumes in which edible organisms are too dispersed to justify continuously filtering them. This is why the whale shark's gigantic body cannot be understood separately from its movement. Its feeding strategy depends on finding places where currents, tides, upwelling, plankton blooms, and the reproductive cycles of other animals temporarily concentrate food. The giant is viable because the ocean is patchy. Once those patches exist, large size can begin to carry advantages of its own. A larger animal can travel long distances between feeding opportunities. It can carry substantial energy reserves through periods when food is less abundant. Its great mouth and filtering surfaces allow it to process large volumes of water when a profitable patch is found. Size can also reduce the number of predators capable of threatening an adult. But none of those advantages means that evolution simply selected for larger and larger whale sharks without constraint. A bigger body costs more to build, takes longer to grow, and must continue finding enough energy to maintain itself. Gigantism works only when the ecological system can pay the bill. The sea is unusually capable of doing that, because it can concentrate extraordinary quantities of small life. On land, a giant animal feeding on tiny airborne organisms would face obvious physical limitations. In water, prey is suspended in a medium that can be moved through a filtering apparatus. Currents gather organisms along fronts. Upwelling carries nutrients towards sunlit water, supporting bursts of productivity. Fish release enormous quantities of eggs. Corals spawn. Zooplankton rise and fall through the water column. What looks like empty blue water to us can, under the right conditions, become a temporary field of food. This helps explain a broader pattern among the largest animals in the ocean. Gigantism and bulk filter feeding have repeatedly appeared together, particularly among vertebrates, able to move between rich but scattered feeding opportunities. The largest animal known to have lived, the blue whale, feeds heavily on krill. The enormous basking shark filters zooplankton. Whale sharks exploit planktonic organisms, fish eggs and small nekton. The details differ enormously, but the underlying arithmetic has something in common. Rather than spending energy capturing one substantial victim at a time, these animals exploit abundance itself. Whale sharks and basking sharks show just how differently that arithmetic can be solved, even within sharks. A basking shark is often seen swimming forward with its huge mouth held open, allowing water to pass through as it moves. This is ram filtration in its most recognizable form. Whale sharks can also feed while moving forward, but they are capable of something more active. They can use suction, rapidly expanding the oral cavity and drawing prey-rich water inward. This allows them to exploit dense patches without simply swimming through them continuously. The megamouth adds another variation, and because the species is encountered so rarely, important details of its natural feeding behavior remain much less directly observed. 3 giant filter-feeding sharks. 3 giant filter-feeding sharks. 3 evolutionary histories, and 3 somewhat different solutions to extracting tiny food from an enormous volume of ocean. The contrast with predatory sharks becomes more interesting the closer we look. A great white carries large serrated teeth designed to seize and cut substantial prey. A whale shark also has teeth, many of them, but they are tiny. The dramatic weaponry that defines our cultural image of a shark has become almost irrelevant to the whale shark's principal feeding strategy. Evolution did not remove every trace of its ancestry and rebuild the animal from nothing. It modified an existing shark body until structures that once carried one significance existed alongside an entirely different way of obtaining food. Even the name Rhincodon reflects how unusual that head appeared to early zoologists. The genus was established from a specimen described by the Scottish physician and naturalist Andrew Smith from South Africa in the early 19th century. At the time, scientists were trying to fit an enormous, broad-headed, spotted shark into a still-developing understanding of shark diversity. Today, after nearly 2 centuries of additional specimens, genetic work and anatomical comparison, the animal remains the only living representative of its family. There is no second species of Rhincodon swimming somewhere else that lets researchers compare 2 slightly different versions of the same experiment. The whale shark is the surviving endpoint of its own distinctive branch. Its evolutionary history is also harder to reconstruct than that of many land animals because sharks leave an uneven fossil record. Cartilage does not preserve as readily as heavily mineralized bone. Teeth fossilize much more easily, which is why extinct predatory sharks with distinctive teeth can sometimes leave abundant evidence while much of the rest of the body disappears. For filter-feeding lineages with tiny teeth, reconstructing ancestry can become even more difficult. Genetics, comparative anatomy, and scattered fossils therefore have to be combined to understand how modern forms are related. What we can say with confidence is that giant filter feeding arose independently in different shark branches, turning away from the idea that there is one inevitable route toward becoming a large shark. And this is where the whale shark becomes more than an unusually large fish. Its existence demonstrates that the word shark describes an evolutionary lineage, not a single lifestyle. Sharks can ambush prey on the seabed, hunt fast fish in open water, crush hard-shelled animals, live in darkness, patrol reefs, or filter microscopic and near-microscopic life from the sea. The whale shark sits at one extreme of that flexibility. Instead of becoming the ocean's largest shark by escalating the machinery of predation, it became the ocean's largest shark by exploiting a resource most large predators could never use efficiently. But there is a catch hidden inside that success. Tiny prey only supports a giant when enough of it can be collected. The difference between swimming through ordinary seawater and swimming through a dense feeding patch can be the difference between spending energy and gaining it. So the evolution of gigantism did not free the whale shark from the small organisms beneath it in the food web. It made the animal profoundly dependent on finding them. That dependency reaches into almost every part of its life. A mouth must be wide enough to take in enormous quantities of water. The throat and gill region must separate food without simply clogging. Water has to leave while prey stays behind. The shark must remain mobile enough to search for patches that can be separated by huge distances, yet efficient enough that traveling between them does not consume the benefit of feeding when it arrives. Its sensory systems have to function in a world where the target is not necessarily one animal to chase, but an invisible change in the surrounding ocean. Its skin has to protect a body that may spend decades traveling through open water. Its gills have to serve two demands at once: extracting oxygen and participating in a feeding system through which immense quantities of seawater can pass. Seen from a distance, the whale shark's shape can look almost simple: broad head, heavy body, enormous tail, pale spots. Up close, that simplicity disappears. The mouth that seems almost comically oversized is connected to a highly specialized filtering system. Behind it sit 5 enormous pairs of gill slits. Thousands of tiny teeth remain inside a mouth that no longer depends on them to dismember prey. The skin is not smooth but armored in microscopic tooth-like structures. Even the small eyes, which seem strangely exposed on such a broad head, have turned out to possess protective features researchers did not appreciate until very recently. The evolutionary story therefore brings us back to the animal beneath the boat. But now the question has changed. We no longer need to ask simply how a shark became so large. The more revealing question is how a shark body, built from an inheritance stretching far back through cartilaginous fishes, was modified until it could make this extraordinary strategy work in the real ocean. And the answer begins at the front of the animal, where a mouth large enough to look threatening opens onto a feeding system designed for prey that may be almost too small to see. And the mouth is where the whale shark begins to look less like an enlarged version of another shark, and more like a machine built around a completely different problem. In most sharks, the mouth sits underneath the snout. In the whale shark, it opens broadly at the very front of the head, a position that makes sense when the objective is not to seize something below the animal, but to take in the water directly ahead. Seen open at close range, it is difficult not to focus on its size. Yet the most important structures are easy to miss. Lining the jaws are rows of teeth, thousands across the entire mouth, but each is tiny. They are remnants of the basic shark design, rather than the principal tools of feeding. A whale shark does not need to bite plankton. The real work happens farther back, where water carrying food is separated from water that can be discarded. Behind the mouth are specialized filtering structures associated with the 5 pairs of gill arches. Rather than behaving like a simple kitchen sieve, this system has to solve a much harder engineering problem. A feeding whale shark can process enormous quantities of seawater containing particles of different sizes, shapes, and densities. If every particle simply struck a fine mesh and remained there, the filter would begin clogging almost immediately. The shark would spend its feeding time cleaning the apparatus instead of eating. Research on suspension-feeding fishes has shown that filtration can be far more sophisticated than straightforward sieving. Water moving across filter surfaces can generate flows that keep particles moving, concentrate them, and reduce direct blockage. In experimental work inspired partly by whale shark morphology, researchers have described vortical cross-step filtration, in which the geometry of the filtering system helps transport particles away from the filter surface rather than allowing them to accumulate there. The remarkable part is that such systems can retain particles smaller than the apparent openings through which the water moves. The shark is not simply straining seawater through something resembling a net. The movement of the water itself helps do the sorting. That distinction becomes visible when the animal feeds. Sometimes a whale shark simply swims forward with its mouth open, allowing its own movement to push prey-rich water into the oral cavity. This is ram feeding, and from a distance it can look almost passive, an enormous mouth traveling through a patch of food. But whale sharks are not limited to moving through prey and hoping enough enters. They can actively create suction. The mouth opens rapidly, the oral cavity expands, and water is pulled inward. When prey is densely concentrated, the shark may remain nearly stationary and repeatedly pump water through the mouth and out through the gill region. In other situations, it can turn upward, bringing the head close to vertical while feeding on a patch concentrated near the surface. More recent observations have even documented whale sharks accelerating towards schools of small fish with the mouth open in a form of lunge feeding. The animal, commonly portrayed as a slow-moving plankton collector, has a feeding repertoire that changes with the prey in front of it. Fish eggs, drifting almost motionlessly at the surface, present one problem. Mobile schooling fish present another. The same mouth can be used differently for each. All of this has to happen while the shark is also breathing. Water passing through the mouth eventually leaves through the gill openings, where the animal's respiratory surfaces extract oxygen. Feeding and respiration therefore occupy the same general flow path, and the head has become a place where several demands meet at once. The animal must move enough water to ventilate enormous gills, separate edible material from that water, prevent the filtration surfaces from becoming uselessly clogged, and then swallow what has been concentrated. The 20 filter pads described within the pharyngeal region form a highly modified part of this system. Organisms above a few millimeters can be retained effectively, while fluid continues outward. Smaller material can also be concentrated through hydrodynamic processes that make the system more capable than a simple pore size explanation would suggest. This is why the thousands of teeth become almost comic by comparison. They are present, but the animal's success depends far more on controlling water than on closing its jaws around prey. A predatory shark turns muscle into acceleration and bite force. A whale shark often turns movement into flow. The mouth is not primarily a weapon, it is an entrance. Behind it, however, the rest of the body still has to carry one of the heaviest fishes through the ocean. There is no bony skeleton hidden beneath that spotted skin. Like other sharks, whale sharks belong to the cartilaginous fishes. Cartilage can be strengthened by mineralization, and the skeleton is not the soft, flimsy material the word might suggest, but it differs fundamentally from the bones supporting a tuna, grouper, or whale. The result is a large body built on the same basic skeletal material that has supported sharks through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Size did not require abandoning the shark blueprint. It required pushing it into territory no living fish has taken farther. Movement reveals how well that blueprint works. A whale shark can look slow because its body is so large. When a tail several meters from the head sweeps from side to side, it does not need to beat with the frantic rhythm of a small fish to move the animal forward. Much of the rear body participates in propulsion, the powerful caudal fin pushing against the water, while the broad pectoral fins help control position. To a diver swimming nearby, this can create a strange mismatch. The shark appears unhurried, yet keeping pace requires constant effort. Large movements performed slowly can still translate into substantial forward travel. Efficiency matters because the animal's food is not waiting in one permanent location. Every kilometer traveled between productive feeding areas costs energy. A body capable of crossing open water cannot afford to waste too much of that energy fighting against the water itself. And here the skin becomes part of the swimming system. Run a hand along shark skin, something nobody should do to a living whale shark simply to test the point. And it does not resemble the smooth surface people often imagine from underwater photographs. Shark skin is covered with microscopic structures called dermal denticles. Their name is revealing. They are tooth-like scales, sharing deep developmental similarities with teeth. On whale sharks, the body denticles have ridged forms consistent with a hydrodynamic role. Across sharks more broadly, denticles can influence the boundary layer of water moving over the body, reduce drag under certain conditions, protect the surface, and make attachment more difficult for some organisms. The spotted giant is therefore wrapped in millions of microscopic structures that help turn its skin from passive covering into functional surface. The spots themselves operate at a completely different scale. Pale circles and lines cover the dark upper body in a pattern so distinctive that a whale shark can be recognized instantly, even when only part of it is visible. The precise evolutionary function of the pattern is not settled. Camouflage has been proposed, particularly because disruptive markings can break up an outline in dappled light. But it would be easy to turn that possibility into a certainty the evidence does not justify. What we can say is that the pattern persists sufficiently for individual sharks to be identified from photographs. a feature that will later become one of the most powerful tools researchers have for following animals they cannot physically track for their entire lives. For now, it is enough to notice how unusual the combination is. A skin covered microscopically in denticles and macroscopically in a pattern that humans can use almost like a natural barcode. Then there are the eyes. They seem almost absurdly small on such a broad head. Positioned laterally near the front, each eye can disappear visually against an animal several meters long. For years, that appearance helped support an assumption that vision might not be especially important to a whale shark. Sharks possess other sensory systems, after all. They can detect dissolved chemicals. Their lateral line system senses movement and pressure changes in surrounding water. Like other elasmobranchs, they possess electroreceptive organs known as ampullae of Lorenzini, capable of detecting weak electrical fields. In an animal feeding on dense patches of tiny organisms, it seemed reasonable to imagine vision playing only a modest role. Then researchers looked at the eye itself. In 2020, a study of whale shark eyes described something not previously known in any vertebrate: dermal denticles covering the exposed surface around the iris. On one examined eye, researchers estimated roughly 2,900 of these tiny structures. They were not simply ordinary body denticles extending accidentally across the eye. Their shape differed from those covering the rest of the shark, with morphology consistent with resistance to abrasion. The eye was, quite literally, armored with tooth-like scales. That alone would have been unusual. But the researchers also documented another protective mechanism. When an object approached the eye, whale sharks could retract the eyeball into the socket. Ultrasound measurements in two animals showed retraction distances of roughly half the diameter of the eye, with the movement occurring in less than a second. The eyeball also rotated as it withdrew. An organ that looked small and exposed was protected by two remarkable systems: thousands of specialized denticles across its surface and the ability to pull itself deeper into the head. The discovery changed the interpretation of the eye. Protection usually carries a cost. Biological structures do not become elaborate for no reason, and an eye equipped with unusual armor and active retraction is harder to dismiss as unimportant. The researchers themselves noted that these features challenge the poorly established idea that whale sharks rely little on vision. It does not prove that sight dominates their sensory world, and we should not replace one assumption with another. It tells us something more useful. Even in an animal people have photographed at close range thousands upon thousands of times, a familiar body part could still contain a mechanism science had barely appreciated. Around that eye, the shark is receiving information through several channels at once. Vision can reveal contrast, movement, and nearby objects. The lateral line detects disturbances through the water. Olfaction provides chemical information. Electroreception gives sharks access to weak bioelectric fields and other electrical cues. How whale sharks combine these senses while searching for widely scattered feeding opportunities remains much harder to establish than simply confirming that the sensory organs exist. There is a temptation to imagine a whale shark detecting a distant plankton bloom with some almost supernatural shark sense, but the evidence does not allow such a simple story. Finding food in the open ocean may involve multiple cues operating over different distances: environmental conditions, currents, chemical signals, visual information, prey movement, and learned or repeated use of productive areas. The animal's sensory world is almost certainly richer than the blue emptiness surrounding it suggests. Seen together, these structures begin to explain why the whale shark cannot be understood by enlarging an ordinary shark in our imagination. The broad mouth is positioned to collect water rather than seize large prey. Tiny teeth remain, while specialized filters perform the work that matters. The gill region handles respiration and food processing through the same moving water. Suction allows the shark to bring prey toward itself instead of relying exclusively on forward motion. A cartilaginous skeleton supports a body of extraordinary scale. A huge tail moves that body between feeding opportunities. Denticles turn the skin into a hydrodynamic and protective surface. Several sensory systems sample an environment in which food can be invisible to us. Even the small eyes carry armor. None of these features exists independently of the animal's central problem. A whale shark has to find enough food to justify being enormous, collect that food efficiently when it appears, and travel through long stretches of ocean when it does not. The anatomy makes the strategy possible, but anatomy alone cannot guarantee that the strategy works. An exquisitely engineered filter is useless in water containing almost nothing worth filtering. A mouth that can process extraordinary volumes of seawater gains little if prey remains too thinly dispersed. The body we have been examining, therefore, only makes ecological sense because, at particular times and in particular places, the ocean does something dramatic. Tiny organisms that are normally scattered through an immense volume of water become concentrated so densely that a giant can arrive and feed. And some of those concentrations are so rich that hundreds of whale sharks can appear in the same patch of sea. Those hundreds of sharks are not gathering because whale sharks are naturally compelled to seek one another. They are gathering because, for a short time, the same patch of ocean becomes worth visiting. From the air, the northeastern tip of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula can look almost impossibly blue. There are no fences in the water, no obvious boundaries separating one feeding ground from another, and nothing on the surface to explain why a giant fish should choose one particular patch of sea. Yet every summer, whale sharks arrive here in numbers that can be difficult to comprehend from a boat. Some years there are dozens. On exceptional days, there have been hundreds. To understand what brings them together, researchers had to stop looking only at the sharks and begin examining what was happening in the water around them. The answer was not simply plankton, it was timing. Plankton is a broad term for organisms carried largely by currents rather than swimming strongly enough to overcome them. Some are microscopic plants, others are animals, copepods, larvae, krill, and countless other forms that spend either part or all of their lives drifting through the sea. Fish eggs can become plankton too. So can the early life stages of animals that, as adults, will be powerful swimmers. To us, a litre of clear seawater may appear empty. To a whale shark, the difference between one body of water and another can be measured in thousands of edible particles. But even for the largest fish alive, not every concentration is worth pursuing. The prey has to become dense enough for the energy gained by filtering it to justify the energy spent finding and processing it. That requirement turns whale shark feeding into a story not only about animals, but about oceanography. The ocean is constantly rearranging its food. Winds move surface water. Tides squeeze currents around islands and headlands. Water masses meet along fronts. In some regions, deeper water rich in nutrients is pushed upward towards sunlight in a process called upwelling. Those nutrients can stimulate phytoplankton growth, which supports zooplankton, which in turn attracts larger animals. Elsewhere, the important event may last only a few nights. Corals release eggs and sperm into the water, fish gather to spawn, or enormous numbers of eggs suddenly drift near the surface. A place that was barely profitable for a whale shark days earlier can become a feeding ground. Ningaloo Reef, along the coast of Western Australia, offers one of the clearest examples of this seasonal machinery. Each year, whale sharks appear there with enough regularity that Ningaloo has become one of the world's best-known places to encounter them. Their arrival occurs during a period of increased biological productivity associated with the annual mass spawning of corals. It is tempting to picture whale sharks simply arriving to consume the coral spawn itself, but the relationship is more complicated. Research indicates that the productivity following the spawning supports dense zooplankton assemblages, including krill on which whale sharks feed. The coral event helps set a much larger food web in motion. A reproductive event on the reef can therefore contribute to conditions that eventually attract an animal weighing several tons. This is one of the recurring patterns in the whale shark's world. The giant often arrives because something much smaller is reproducing. At Gladden Spit in Belize, whale shark appearances have been associated with spawning aggregations of reef fishes. In the Arabian Gulf, researchers studying whale sharks around offshore platforms in Qatari waters found them feeding in areas containing fish spawn, including eggs identified through DNA barcoding as belonging to mackerel tuna. The platforms themselves may influence where tuna gather, creating an unusual intersection between human structures, spawning fish, and whale sharks. The whale shark is not necessarily searching for a particular coastline in the way a migrating bird might return to one nesting tree. It is exploiting biological opportunities produced by many other species, each following its own calendar. Nowhere has that connection been documented more dramatically than off the Yucatan Peninsula. For generations, local fishermen knew that whale sharks appeared in these waters. Scientific surveys eventually began documenting a regular summer aggregation near Cabo Catoche, where the Gulf of Mexico meets the Caribbean. The water there can be relatively shallow, green and turbid. Beneath its surface are dense patches of crustacean zooplankton, particularly copepods and small surgested shrimp. Whale sharks arrive and feed within these productive waters, sometimes remaining in the wider region for weeks or months. Then researchers began hearing about something farther offshore. Fishermen had spoken of whale sharks beyond the familiar coastal area, and in 2006 researchers confirmed a second aggregation. They called it the afuera, the outside. The setting looked wrong. Instead of shallow green coastal water, the afuera occurred in clearer blue water east of the Yucatan's northeastern tip. To human eyes, the blue water appeared less productive. Yet whale sharks were gathering there in extraordinary numbers. During aerial surveys in September 2006, more than 200 were counted on one flight. A photograph taken several days later captured dozens feeding at the surface together. Then, in 2009, the event became almost unbelievable. On August 12th, observers counted 420 whale sharks during a single aerial survey, concentrated within an area of roughly 18 square kilometers. At the time, it was the largest aggregation of whale sharks ever scientifically reported. 420 of the largest fish on Earth, feeding in one relatively small piece of ocean. The obvious question was what they had found. Researchers lowered plankton nets into the blue water. At the familiar Cabo Catoche site, samples contained the expected mixture of crustacean zooplankton. At the afuera, the net began filling with something else: fish eggs. There were so many that researchers shortened one plankton tow to only 40 seconds to avoid clogging the net. The samples consisted almost entirely of eggs, suspended in water, clear enough that the extraordinary concentration was not obvious from above. DNA barcoding identified the dominant eggs as those of the little tunny, Euthenus aliteratus, a fast-swimming member of the tuna family. The whale sharks had revealed a spawning event that scientists had not previously understood at this scale. The relationship is extraordinary because the two animals could hardly seem more different. Little tunny are fast predators built to pursue other animals through the water. Whale sharks are gigantic filter feeders. Yet, for a brief stage in the tuna's life cycle, the reproductive output of one becomes the food supply of the other. Millions upon millions of transparent eggs transform blue seawater into a feeding opportunity rich enough to attract hundreds of sharks. Measurements helped show why the afuera was so attractive. The fish eggs were not dramatically more energy-rich gram for gram than the mixed zooplankton at Cabo Catoche. What mattered was concentration. Researchers estimated prey density at the afuera at about 3 times that measured at the coastal site in their comparison. Their rough calculations suggested that an average whale shark feeding for 8 hours under those conditions might obtain far more energy at the egg-rich afuera than during the same feeding period at Cabo Catoche. The precise numbers depend on assumptions and should not be treated as a universal feeding budget, but the ecological lesson is clear. For a filter feeder, density can matter as much as the identity of the prey. That helps explain why whale sharks are capable of eating a surprisingly varied menu without abandoning the same fundamental strategy. Copepods, krill, shrimp, fish eggs, and small fishes differ enormously from one another, but all can become profitable when concentrated densely enough. Recent feeding ecology work has directly observed whale sharks consuming suggested shrimp zooplankton and occasionally small inshore fishes, adding to a broader picture in which the species is better described as an opportunistic filter feeder than as an animal devoted to one kind of plankton. The shark changes its behavior accordingly. When food is spread across the surface, it may swim forward with the mouth open, the broad head cutting through the water, as prey is carried into the filtration system. In dense patches, it can use suction, opening and closing the mouth while drawing water inward. Sometimes the shark turns almost upright. The tail drops beneath it, the head rises toward the surface, and the animal appears to hang vertically in the water while repeatedly feeding from a concentrated layer above. Seen from a boat, the huge mouth may break the surface again and again, while the rest of the animal remains suspended below. These are not random poses. They are different solutions to the geometry of food. If prey forms a horizontal layer, swimming through it may work. If it is trapped against the surface, approaching from below can be more efficient. If mobile prey begins escaping, the shark can adjust again. What looks like a simple act, opening an enormous mouth, contains a series of decisions about where food is concentrated and how best to capture it. The Afuera showed how quickly those decisions can rearrange an entire aggregation. Researchers noticed that years with increased numbers offshore could coincide with fewer sharks at Cabo Catoche. Tagging and similar sex ratios suggested that at least some of the same regional animals were moving between these feeding opportunities. The sharks were not attached to the human idea of one famous whale shark site. They were responding to whichever part of the region was paying the better energetic return. That distinction matters because it changes what an aggregation means. Hundreds of whale sharks together might look social, and whale sharks certainly tolerate one another while feeding. But a gathering does not necessarily mean that the animals came to meet each other. Often they have independently arrived at the same answer to the same environmental problem. Food has become concentrated here, now. The gathering is therefore temporary by design. A spawning event cannot continue indefinitely. Eggs hatch or are eaten. Zooplankton patches disperse. Currents shift. Upwelling changes. Seasonal productivity rises and falls. The very processes that create a feeding hotspot eventually dismantle it. This makes the whale shark's apparent predictability more fragile than it first seems. Humans can learn that sharks usually arrive at Ningaloo during a particular part of the year, or that the Yucatan hosts enormous summer aggregations. But the animals are ultimately responding to ecological conditions rather than our calendar. In 2007, researchers surveying the Afuera failed to observe the huge gathering seen in other years. In 2009, it became enormous. The sharks were revealing changes in the food landscape that were not always obvious from the surface, and those changes occur across the world. Whale sharks appear seasonally around islands, reefs, continental shelves, and offshore features where physical oceanography and biological timing combine to produce unusually profitable feeding conditions. Some sites are associated with zooplankton blooms, others with fish spawning. Some involve productive fronts or upwelling. The details vary, but the pattern is consistent enough to reshape the way we think about the species. A whale shark does not live in a world made of fixed feeding grounds. It lives in a world of events, an invisible bloom beginning, a current turning, a mass spawning happening after dark, fish releasing eggs into the upper ocean, a concentration forming along a front, a patch becoming dense enough to justify the journey. That creates a much harder question than simply asking what whale sharks eat. Somehow, an animal moving through an enormous three-dimensional ocean repeatedly finds these opportunities. Exactly how it does so remains only partly understood. Local environmental cues almost certainly matter. Chemical information, prey movement, temperature, currents and other sensory signals may help at shorter scales. Repeated seasonal use of productive regions suggests that experience and predictable oceanographic cycles can also play roles. But we should be careful not to give the shark abilities that have never been demonstrated. There is no evidence that a whale shark can somehow smell a particular spawning event from hundreds of kilometers away and navigate directly toward it. The real process is likely a combination of movement, environmental structure, sensory information, and the fact that certain productive regions recur often enough to be worth revisiting. The ocean itself helps guide the search because productivity is not random. Upwelling tends to occur where winds, currents, and underwater topography make it possible. Spawning aggregations recur where the reproductive biology of other species brings adults together. Fronts form where water masses meet. Islands and continental shelves alter currents. A whale shark traveling through these environments is not searching an entirely featureless wilderness. It is moving through a landscape made of water, one whose mountains are temperature gradients, whose valleys are depth contours, and whose richest fields can appear for only days. That hidden landscape also explains why humans see such a distorted fraction of whale shark life. We encounter them most easily when the ocean concentrates their food near the surface and close to accessible coastlines. Those are the moments when an enormous animal becomes visible, photographable, and predictable. They are also the moments that have shaped almost everything most people imagine about whale sharks. But feeding is only one part of a life. Eventually, the little tunny stop filling the Yucatan water with eggs. The productive patch weakens. A shark that spent morning after morning at the surface has less reason to remain there. One by one, the spotted backs become harder to find. Aerial observers can count hundreds when the animals are feeding in clear surface water. The same aircraft may see none once those sharks descend. A boat can follow one across a feeding ground. It cannot follow it across an ocean. And so the same ecological system that briefly gathers whale sharks into some of the most spectacular wildlife concentrations on Earth eventually releases them again. The feast disperses, the mouths close, and animals that seemed impossible to lose begin moving away from the one place where humans knew exactly where to find them. The disappearance is not dramatic when it happens. There is no moment when hundreds of whale sharks suddenly turn away from a feeding ground and begin a synchronized migration into the open sea. One animal leaves, another becomes harder to find. Surface sightings become less frequent. A place that only weeks earlier seemed crowded with enormous spotted bodies gradually returns to ordinary water. From the deck of a boat, the explanation appears simple. The sharks have gone somewhere else. For scientists, that somewhere else became one of the hardest parts of the animal's life to reconstruct. A whale shark can be unmistakable when it is feeding a few meters below the surface, and almost impossible to follow once it decides to leave. The difficulty is not that the animal becomes invisible in some unusual biological sense. It is that the ocean is enormous, three-dimensional, and mostly inaccessible to continuous observation. A research vessel can follow a shark for hours. It cannot trail the same animal across months of open ocean. Aircraft can survey the surface, but a whale shark swimming 50 meters down might as well not be there. Even a giant disappears quickly when the search area expands from a feeding patch to an ocean basin. For much of the history of whale shark research, this created a peculiar bias. Scientists knew the species best at the places where it was easiest to see. Coastal feeding aggregations produced sightings, measurements, and photographs, but those encounters were snapshots. What happened between them was largely missing. Tagging began turning those missing periods into data, although no single tag solves the problem. Acoustic transmitters are useful when researchers want to know whether a shark returns to a particular region. The tag emits a coded signal that underwater receivers can detect when the animal passes within range. At a Red Sea aggregation site called Shib Habil, researchers deployed an array of 63 acoustic receivers and accumulated more than 37,000 detections from tagged whale sharks over several years. The system showed seasonal use of the site and documented individuals leaving and returning in later years. But acoustic telemetry has an obvious limitation. The receiver has to be there. Once the shark moves beyond the listening network, silence does not tell you whether it traveled 50 kilometers or 5,000. Satellite technology widened the window. One approach uses transmitters that can communicate with satellites when the tag reaches the surface. Another uses pop-up satellite archival tags, often called PSATs. These devices remain attached while recording information such as depth, water temperature, and light. At a programmed time, or under certain conditions, the tag releases from the shark, floats upward, and begins transmitting summaries of what it recorded. If researchers physically recover the tag, they can sometimes retrieve a much richer, high-resolution archive. If they do not, the information has to travel through a satellite connection with limited bandwidth. A device smaller than the shark's dorsal fin may therefore contain months of movement history, but getting that history back is never guaranteed. Tags detach early, some never report. Batteries fail. Attachment points are lost. Transmissions can be incomplete. A tag floating at the surface tells researchers where the instrument ended its journey, not necessarily every precise position the shark occupied before that moment. Light-based geolocation can estimate broad movements while an animal remains submerged, but it is less precise than a GPS point. Even successful studies therefore produce something closer to fragments of a diary than a continuous film. The fragments have been enough to overturn the image of the whale shark as primarily a surface animal. Between 2009 and 2012, researchers working near Al-Lith on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast fitted dozens of juvenile whale sharks with satellite tags. Most remained within the southern Red Sea during the periods for which researchers received data. Several moved north. 5 left the Red Sea altogether, passed through the Bab el-Mandeb region into the Gulf of Aden, and continued toward the northern Indian Ocean. Final tag positions indicated movements of up to roughly 2,950 kilometers during those deployments. The horizontal tracks were already impressive, but the depth record revealed a second journey happening at the same time. These sharks regularly descended to around 400 meters. Several passed 1,000 meters. The deepest measurement in that study reached 1,360 meters. At 1,360 meters, the surface world of whale shark tourism has vanished. Sunlight capable of supporting photosynthesis is long gone. Pressure is more than 100 times what it is at the surface. In most oceans, the water is cold, and the visual environment is defined not by coral reefs and snorkelers, but by darkness interrupted by the light produced by living organisms. A fish that people associate with warm tropical sunlight is perfectly capable of entering this other ocean. And 1,360 meters was not the limit revealed elsewhere. Researchers studying whale sharks tagged around the Yucatan Peninsula and eastern Gulf of Mexico recovered depth records from dozens of animals. In offshore waters, the sharks still spent most of their time in the upper 200 meters, but they regularly made excursions below 500 meters. One tag recorded a descent to 1,928 meters. That is almost 2 kilometers below the surface. The shark did not live permanently at that depth. These were excursions from a life spent mostly higher in the water column. But the dives were not isolated accidents. The records showed structured vertical behavior, including repeated descents and ascents whose patterns changed between coastal feeding periods and offshore movements. The question was obvious. Why would an animal so often observed feeding near the surface go that deep? There is no single answer established for every dive, and pretending otherwise would make the story less interesting rather than more complete. Food is one possibility. The ocean contains an enormous community of fishes, crustaceans, and gelatinous organisms that spend daylight hours in deeper water and rise toward the surface at night. Collectively, these organisms form what sonar operators discovered as the deep scattering layer, a moving concentration of life so dense that early sonar could mistake it for the sea floor. Many animals exploit this vertical migration. In the Gulf of Mexico tracking data, researchers noticed that some extreme whale shark dives contained brief changes in vertical direction, around several hundred meters deep. One interpretation is that the sharks may have encountered prey associated with deeper scattering layers. The evidence is suggestive rather than a direct observation of feeding nearly 2 kilometers down, but it provides a plausible reason why a filter feeder would enter water far beneath the productive surface. Navigation has also been proposed as a possible function of some deep dives. Moving through different depths exposes an animal to changes in temperature, pressure, currents, and potentially geomagnetic information. Whether whale sharks use extreme dives specifically to orient themselves remains unresolved. The danger is that a mysterious behavior invites an explanation before the evidence has earned one. A dive may serve different purposes at different times. Feeding, orientation, and environmental sampling are not mutually exclusive. Temperature adds another layer. Descending hundreds of meters can expose a whale shark to dramatically colder water. Because whale sharks are ectothermic, their body temperature is strongly influenced by their surroundings. Researchers examining dive patterns have found evidence consistent with behavioral thermoregulation. After long or deep exposure to cold water, sharks may spend extended periods near warmer surface waters. In other words, the time spent near the surface may sometimes be connected to what happened hundreds of meters below. The warm upper ocean is not merely where humans happen to see the animal. It may function as part of a cycle between deep water activity and physiological recovery. The Red Sea produced an especially useful natural experiment. Deep water there remains unusually warm compared with many other ocean basins. In the tagging study near Al-Lith, water below about 200 meters remained around 21.7 degrees Celsius through great depths. When a tag recorded temperatures colder than that, researchers could infer that the shark had left the Red Sea even when precise location data were incomplete. Temperature became geographical evidence. A sensor attached to a moving animal could reveal that it had crossed into another body of water simply because the deep ocean around it had become colder. This is the strange power of tagging. Researchers may never see the shark during the journey, yet its environment leaves traces in the record. Depth rises and falls, temperature changes, light disappears. A tag surfaces hundreds or thousands of kilometers from where it was attached. The shark itself remains unseen, but parts of its journey can be reconstructed from what the instrument experienced while traveling with it. Sometimes those movements stretch far beyond the region where the story began. One female tagged in the eastern tropical Pacific was followed on a remarkable journey extending from Panamanian waters across the Pacific toward the region of the Mariana Trench. Over 841 days, the reconstructed movement exceeded 20,000 kilometers. Such tracks should not be treated as a standard migration route followed by every whale shark. Individuals can behave very differently, but they demonstrate the scale available to the species. A shark photographed near Central America can later occupy a completely different part of the world's largest ocean. Other animals do almost the opposite. Some return repeatedly to the same productive regions. In the Red Sea, combined acoustic, photographic, and satellite evidence documented sharks leaving the aggregation at Shib Habil and returning in subsequent years. In the Arabian Gulf, satellite-tagged animals often remained within the region despite crossing national maritime boundaries, dispersing away from summer feeding areas and later showing repeated seasonal use. One presumably pregnant female behaved very differently, traveling roughly 2,600 kilometers from Qatar toward the region near the Yemeni-Somali border before her tag detached. This variability matters. Whale shark migration is not one clean arrow that can be drawn on a world map. Some individuals show strong regional residency. Some make long excursions. Some return seasonally. Some cross international boundaries repeatedly. Juveniles encountered at one aggregation may behave differently from mature adults elsewhere. Males and females may not use the ocean in identical ways, and because researchers disproportionately encounter certain age and sex classes at accessible feeding sites, even the movement patterns we know best may represent only part of the population. A satellite track can also create a misleading sense of completeness. Draw a line from one location to another, and the animal appears to have traveled across a flat map. But the shark's real path is three-dimensional. While moving a few hundred kilometers horizontally, it may travel many additional kilometers vertically, rising and falling through the water column again and again. In the Gulf of Mexico study, sharks in oceanic waters spent about 95% of their recorded time shallower than 200 meters, Yet the occasional extreme dives carried them into a completely different physical environment. A map showing only latitude and longitude would erase that entire part of their lives. Even the phrase surface whale shark begins to feel misleading. The surface is where the animal becomes available to us. It is where boats can approach, where photographs can be taken, and where some satellite transmitters can communicate most easily. It is not necessarily where the most important parts of the shark's life occur. A whale shark can feed beside a boat in the morning, descend through hundreds of meters of water later that day, move offshore after a seasonal food source collapses, cross a national boundary without knowing one exists, and eventually return to a productive region months later. Much of that journey may occur without a human eye seeing the animal once. And despite all the technology, there is a frustrating point at which many tracks end. The tag releases, the transmission stops, the battery dies, the instrument is lost. A line on a map reaches its final coordinate, even though the shark keeps swimming. Scientists therefore needed something that did not require a transmitter to remain attached. Something permanent enough to recognize the same animal after months or years had passed, even if it returned without a tag and on the other side of an ocean. They had been looking at it all along. Across every whale shark's body, the pale spots that make the species instantly recognizable are arranged in a pattern that belongs to that individual. The pale spots had always made whale sharks easy to recognize as a species. The important discovery was that they could also make one whale shark distinguishable from another. Look closely at the area just behind the gills and above the pectoral fin, and the pattern stops looking random. One shark may carry 3 spots, forming a rough triangle beside a short white stripe. Another has a larger spot in the same general area, surrounded by several smaller ones. To a swimmer passing the animal once, those differences are almost impossible to remember. To a camera, they can remain preserved for years. And unlike a plastic tag or satellite transmitter, the pattern does not have to be attached by a researcher. The shark arrives with it. This offered scientists something they badly needed. Instead of asking whether a tagged animal had returned, they could begin asking whether any shark photographed today had been seen before, even if the person holding the camera had no idea that the animal already had a history. The technique is known as photo identification, and its basic principle is wonderfully simple. Researchers photograph a standardized region on the side of the whale shark, usually the area behind the 5th gill slit and above the pectoral fin. That section provides a useful combination of spots and stripes that can be compared between encounters. Ideally, photographs are taken from both sides because each side has its own pattern, and researchers also record information such as sex, estimated length, location, date, and any scars or injuries. A photograph that might look like a souvenir from a dive can therefore become a scientific record of one individual at one place and one moment in its life. The problem came when the number of photographs began to grow. Comparing 10 sharks by eye is manageable. Comparing hundreds becomes tedious. Comparing thousands collected across years and countries turns identification into a completely different problem. Every new image might need to be checked against an enormous catalogue of previous encounters, and underwater photographs are rarely perfect. The shark may be angled away from the camera. Light changes with depth, the body bends as it swims. Spots that appear close together in one photograph can look farther apart in another. Scars appear, the animal grows. A matching system had to recognize the geometry of the pattern despite all of that variation. The unlikely solution came from a field of science that seemed to have almost nothing to do with sharks. Astronomers had already faced a related problem. A telescope produces an image containing points of light, and a computer may need to determine which stars it is seeing, even when the image has been rotated, shifted, or viewed at a different scale. To do that, astronomical pattern recognition methods compare the geometric relationships between stars. In the early 2000s, researchers Zayvon Arzoumanian, Jason Holmberg, and Brad Norman realized that a whale shark's spots could be treated in a remarkably similar way. Instead of points of light against black space, there were pale spots against dark skin. The geometry between groups of spots could be compared mathematically. A method created to recognize arrangements in the night sky could be adapted to recognize arrangements on the world's largest fish. The comparison is almost too perfect for a documentary, but it is real. Researchers effectively began treating the skin of a whale shark like a field of stars. The early computer-assisted system did not magically identify every shark without human involvement. Photographs first had to be prepared so that the relevant region could be analyzed, and the software produced candidate matches ranked by similarity. A researcher then inspected the likely matches and confirmed whether two photographs really showed the same animal. In the original published testing, the astronomical algorithm performed well enough to demonstrate that large-scale computer-assisted whale shark identification was practical. That mattered far beyond saving researchers time. It changed the scale at which individual lives could be studied. A whale shark photographed in one season could now be compared efficiently with animals photographed years earlier. An image submitted in one country could potentially be checked against a wider collection. As the database grew, every photograph became more valuable because it was no longer an isolated observation. It could connect two moments separated by months, years, or enormous distances. This developed into the Yakutian Whale Shark Photo Identification Library, and eventually the global system now known as Wild Book for Whale Sharks. The idea behind it was unusually open for wildlife research. Scientists did not have to be the only people collecting useful data. Divers, snorkelers, guides, photographers, and tourists were already encountering whale sharks and carrying cameras. If those photographs showed the correct part of the animal clearly enough, they could contribute to the same identification process. Suddenly, the people traveling around the world to see whale sharks could become part of the observation network. That matters because professional research teams cannot be everywhere. A scientist may conduct surveys for several weeks each year. Dive operators can be on the water throughout an entire season. Tourists may photograph an animal on a day when no researcher is present. A photograph taken for entirely personal reasons can contain exactly the information needed to establish that a known shark returned. Citizen science therefore expanded the number of eyes watching the species without requiring thousands of animals to be physically captured and tagged. By 2020, dedicated whale shark photo identification programs were operating at least 25 sites around the world, and a large global analysis assembled records for 8,976 individually identified sharks from those locations. Some sites contained only a few dozen known individuals. Others contained hundreds or more than 1,000. Together, the photographs began revealing something that individual encounters never could: patterns through time. Imagine a shark photographed at Ningaloo Reef. The first image establishes an identity. A year later, another photograph matches. Then another appears several seasons after that. What began as 3 pictures becomes a history. The animal is no longer simply a whale shark seen at Ningaloo. It is one particular shark that used the region repeatedly. Extend the process across enough individuals and researchers can ask whether returning is common, how long animals remain in an area, whether the same sharks appear every year, and whether some individuals eventually stop returning. One shark in a global residency analysis showed repeated use of donsol in the Philippines across approximately 21 years, a span comparable to long-term fidelity documented at Ningaloo. 21 years changes the meaning of a photograph. A tourist may spend 20 minutes beside an animal whose relationship with that stretch of ocean extends across decades. Photo identification can also reveal the opposite behavior. Some sharks are photographed once and never seen at that site again. Others appear repeatedly within a season but disappear in later years. Some are identified in another region. The important point is that absence becomes something researchers can begin analyzing statistically rather than simply wondering about. This is where capture-recapture methods become useful. Traditionally, a biologist might physically capture an animal, mark it, release it, and later record whether the marked individual is captured again. Whale shark photo identification can create a non-invasive version of the same logic. The first good photograph effectively becomes the capture. A later photograph of the same spot pattern becomes a recapture. Researchers do not need to hold the animal or attach anything to it. Once enough histories accumulate, mathematical models can use the proportions of new and returning individuals to estimate things that cannot be counted directly, including local abundance, apparent survival, residency, and movement. The calculations are more complicated than simply dividing photographs by sharks, because observation effort varies, and an animal that is not photographed may still be present. But the underlying idea is intuitive. If researchers photograph 100 sharks this season, and a large fraction are already known from previous years, that tells a different population story from a season in which almost every animal is new. The database also makes it possible to separate residency from familiarity. At some locations, the same individuals return repeatedly but stay only briefly during each visit. At others, sharks may remain in the wider area for longer periods. A global analysis of 25 aggregation sites found enormous variation in these patterns. The ocean was not producing one universal whale shark lifestyle. Different places were being used differently, and individual histories made those differences visible. Even growth can be studied through repeated encounters. If the same shark is photographed and measured across years, researchers can estimate how its length changes with time. This is not as straightforward as it sounds. Estimating the length of a giant fish underwater by eye is notoriously unreliable, so researchers increasingly use techniques such as laser photogrammetry, stereo video, or standardized measurements when possible. But once a known individual has reliable measurements at different ages, the photographs begin recording not just where the animal went, but how its body changed. A young shark can effectively grow through the database. The same is true of injuries. A propeller scar visible in one photograph can be compared with later images to see how it heals. A damaged fin can become another recognizable feature. The spot pattern provides the identity. Everything else on the body becomes part of the biography. One of the clearest modern examples comes from Indonesia's Bird's Head seascape. Researchers combined 13 years of photographic records collected between 2010 and 2023 and identified 268 individual whale sharks. More than half were seen again at least once. One juvenile male was photographed across a span of 10.63 years. Another was recorded 12 times over roughly a decade. One particularly familiar juvenile male was documented 34 times in just a few years around fishing platforms in Kaimana. These are not abstract population points anymore. They are individual animals repeatedly returning to parts of the same marine landscape. A shark can disappear beneath the surface after one encounter, and 10 years later, the geometry of a few pale spots can prove that it came back. Yet the most important result of photo identification was not simply that scientists learned to recognize individuals. It was what happened when they began putting all those identities together. Once thousands of encounters could be assigned to specific sharks, researchers could count not only who returned, but what kinds of animals kept appearing. At 25 sites included in one global analysis, nearly 3/4 of identified individuals were male. Most sites were dominated by juveniles, with an average shark length of about 5.7 meters. Some places were even more extreme. Donsol's identified population was heavily male-biased. East Kalimantan and Honda Bay were overwhelmingly male. Ningaloo also contained far more males than females. The pattern was not universal. Places such as the Galapagos showed something dramatically different, but it was widespread enough to create a problem. For years, famous aggregation sites had given researchers access to hundreds and eventually thousands of whale sharks. That should have made the population feel increasingly complete. Instead, the better scientists became at identifying exactly who they were seeing, the more obvious it became that they were repeatedly seeing only certain portions of the species. The technology borrowed from astronomy had done more than give names to anonymous giants. It had exposed the empty spaces in the catalogue. If so many of the whale sharks gathering at accessible feeding sites were young males, then a large part of the population was spending its life somewhere else. The photographs could tell researchers exactly who had returned. they could not explain why so many others were missing. The photographs could tell researchers exactly who had returned. They could not explain why so many others were missing. Once enough individual histories accumulated, that absence stopped looking like an accident. Across many of the world's best-known whale shark gathering sites, the same demographic pattern appeared again and again. The sharks humans encountered most often were not a representative cross-section of the population. They were disproportionately young, and they were disproportionately male. In a global comparison involving 25 aggregation sites and 8,976 individually identified whale sharks, nearly 3/4 of the identified animals were male, while 23 of the 25 sites were dominated by juveniles. The average shark was about 5.7 meters long, enormous by ordinary standards, but still well short of the size reached by the largest adults. Places that seemed to contain extraordinary numbers of whale sharks were therefore showing us something closer to a particular stage of whale shark life. A person could enter the water at Ningaloo, or another famous feeding ground, see spotted bodies in several directions and reasonably feel surrounded by the species. Yet many of those sharks shared remarkably similar circumstances, young animals exploiting a reliable source of food. Photo identification made that bias especially clear because researchers could distinguish 100 sightings from 100 different sharks. The same juvenile might return year after year, sometimes remaining associated with a productive region for long periods before disappearing and returning again in another season. From the shark's perspective, this makes ecological sense. Growing an animal toward the size of a bus requires energy, and a young whale shark that discovers a place where currents and seasonal events repeatedly concentrate food has little reason to abandon that knowledge. Returning to a productive feeding area can be safer energetically than searching an enormous ocean for something better. What remains harder to explain is why young males so often dominate these gatherings. Food cannot be the entire answer, because young females need to grow as well. The imbalance suggests that males and females begin using the ocean differently before either has reached full maturity. Researchers have considered differences in movement, habitat preference, and energetic strategy, but there is no single explanation that resolves the pattern everywhere. What the data reveal more confidently is segregation. Whale sharks of different ages, sizes, and sexes do not distribute themselves evenly through the same habitats. And the moment researchers look beyond the classic feeding aggregations, the population begins to change. Around Darwin Island in the Galapagos, the familiar pattern is almost reversed. Instead of crowds dominated by juvenile males, many of the whale sharks encountered there are enormous females. Some exceed 10 meters. Many are considered mature, and some have conspicuously swollen abdomens that have raised the possibility that they are pregnant. Satellite tracking has shown adult females leaving the Galapagos and traveling into the open Pacific, associating with large-scale oceanographic features rather than remaining close to a coastal feeding ground. St. Helena, isolated in the South Atlantic, provides another unusual glimpse. There, researchers have documented a much more balanced sex ratio and a comparatively high proportion of apparently mature animals. These places matter precisely because they are exceptions. They reveal that the juvenile male world humans know so well is not the whale shark's entire world. A mature animal faces different biological demands from a juvenile. A young shark needs to survive and accumulate enough energy to grow. An adult must still feed, but reproduction is now part of the equation. Larger body size may also change which habitats are profitable. A giant adult can carry greater energy reserves and travel efficiently across long distances, allowing it to exploit offshore environments where food may be abundant but far less predictable. Juveniles may benefit from repeatedly visiting reliable coastal feeding grounds. Adults may be capable of operating across a much larger and more scattered oceanic landscape. That idea becomes especially important for females. Producing young is energetically expensive, and if mating, gestation, or birth occurs far offshore, mature females could spend enormous portions of their lives in precisely the places where scientists have the least opportunity to encounter them. Photo identification and satellite tagging therefore reveal two sides of the same problem. Photographs show which sharks repeatedly return to accessible sites. Tags show that some individuals leaving those sites can travel through vast areas of open ocean and descend far beyond the reach of direct observation. Together, the methods expose the danger of mistaking visibility for knowledge. We are exceptionally good at studying whale sharks when they cooperate with the geography of human research, when they feed near the surface, near a coastline, in clear water, during a predictable season. Once they stop doing those things, the amount we know falls dramatically. The mature females make that painfully obvious. We know they exist, and we occasionally encounter spectacularly large individuals in oceanic regions, but their reproductive lives remain mostly hidden. Even determining maturity in a female is harder than in a male. Male sharks possess external claspers that change as the animal develops, providing researchers with visible clues to reproductive maturity. Females offer no equivalent external marker. Size can provide an indication, and a distended abdomen may suggest pregnancy, but neither allows a researcher watching a female swim past to reconstruct what is actually happening inside her body. An animal carrying one of the most important unanswered stories in marine biology can therefore pass within meters of a camera and leave almost nothing behind except photographs and a position on a map. Yet, even mature females are easier to find than another part of the population. Somewhere in the ocean are newborn whale sharks, and remarkably few people have ever seen them. Every 10-meter giant began as a much smaller animal, but the earliest stage of whale shark life is almost absent from the famous aggregation sites. Very small individuals are reported only rarely, often through chance encounters, fisheries records, or unusual offshore observations. There is no universally accepted whale shark nursery comparable to the well-known nursery habitats of some other shark species, and scientists still cannot point to a map and say with confidence, this is where whale sharks normally give birth. That missing beginning creates one of the strangest gaps in the entire story. We can identify individual juveniles from their spots. We can watch some of them return for years. We can attach instruments that record dives approaching 2 kilometers deep. We can follow adults across thousands of kilometers of ocean, yet the place where most whale sharks spend their first days remains largely unknown. Recent attempts to compile records of the smallest individuals have produced intriguing clues. Neonate-sized whale sharks have sometimes been encountered in offshore regions associated with highly productive surface waters and permanent oxygen minimum zones, where deeper layers contain extremely little oxygen. One possibility is that such environments could offer young sharks a useful combination: food near the surface and deeper water that some large predators may be less able to exploit. But there is another explanation that is equally important to consider. Perhaps these are not special birthing areas at all. Perhaps newborn whale sharks occur across much broader stretches of ocean, and the environmental conditions in these regions simply make them more likely to remain near the surface, where humans have a chance of seeing them. With so few observations, the difference between a true biological pattern and an observation bias is difficult to establish, and that uncertainty is exactly the lesson emerging from the demographic puzzle. Whale shark research has repeatedly been shaped by where humans can see the animals. A crowded aggregation feels informative because there are so many sharks in front of us. But abundance in one place does not mean we are seeing the population as a whole. It may mean we have discovered one stage in a much larger life cycle. The picture beginning to emerge is of an animal whose relationship with the ocean changes as it grows. The smallest sharks live through a poorly observed beginning. Some juveniles later appear at productive coastal sites, where males in particular can become remarkably predictable visitors. As body size increases and sexual maturity approaches, patterns can change. Adults may make greater use of offshore habitats. Mature females appear in very different places from the juvenile males dominating many tourism hotspots. Some move through vast oceanic systems, where following them becomes extraordinarily difficult. None of these divisions is absolute, and there are exceptions, but the broad pattern explains something that once seemed contradictory. Scientists can have databases containing thousands of individually recognizable whale sharks while still knowing surprisingly little about crucial parts of the species' life. In fact, the database helped expose what was missing. The better researchers became at recognizing the sharks they could see, the clearer it became that certain sharks were scarcely represented at all. Two absences now sit at opposite ends of the same biological story. Somewhere are the large mature females that spend much of their time away from the juvenile feeding grounds. Somewhere are the newborns that almost never appear there. Between those two groups lies the part of whale shark biology that has resisted observation more completely than almost anything else: how the largest fish in the world actually creates the next generation. Somewhere beyond those familiar feeding grounds, the missing females and the missing newborns are connected by a process we understand largely from a single extraordinary animal. In 1995, off the eastern coast of Taiwan, a female whale shark was caught at a time when the species was still legally fished there. She measured about 10.6 meters long. Nothing about the capture suggested that this individual would become one of the most important whale sharks ever examined by science. Then her reproductive tract was opened. Inside were 304 developing young, not eggs waiting to be laid onto the seabed, and not a handful of embryos, but hundreds of whale sharks at different stages of development. Some were still enclosed within egg cases and attached to large yolk sacs. Others had already emerged from those cases inside the mother. The most developed were roughly half a meter long, their yolk largely absorbed, their bodies already carrying the spots and stripes that would identify them as whale sharks from the beginning of life. Until this female was examined, even the basic reproductive strategy of the species had remained uncertain. An egg case containing a whale shark embryo had previously been recovered from the Gulf of Mexico, encouraging the idea that the species might lay eggs. The Taiwanese female changed that interpretation completely. Whale sharks fertilize their eggs internally, as sharks do generally, but the developing embryos remain inside the female. Males possess a pair of claspers extending from the pelvic fins. During mating, one is used to transfer sperm into the female reproductive tract. After fertilization, whale shark embryos develop within egg capsules retained inside the uterus, relying primarily on the yolk packaged with them rather than forming a placenta like a mammalian fetus. They hatch from those capsules before leaving the mother and are eventually born alive. The modern term is aplacental viviparity. It is a complicated name for something easier to picture. The egg exists, but much of what we normally imagine happening outside the mother's body takes place inside it instead. The Taiwanese shark showed this entire sequence almost at once. Egg cases, embryos still carrying external yolk sacs, and much more developed young were present together. That range created another mystery. If all 304 offspring belonged to the same pregnancy, why did they appear to be at such different stages? One possibility was that the female had mated with several males at different times, producing groups of embryos conceived at different moments. Another was that fertilization itself had been spread across time. For years, there was no way to know. The embryos were preserved, and more than a decade later, researchers returned to them with a tool unavailable to the scientists who had first described the litter in detail: genetic paternity analysis. They selected 29 embryos, about 10% of the litter, deliberately choosing individuals spanning much of the range of sizes and developmental stages. Using microsatellite markers, they compared their genetic profiles. If the embryos represented different mating events with different fathers, that difference might appear in the DNA. Instead, all 29 were consistent with being full siblings fathered by the same male. The researchers could not prove that every one of the 304 embryos had the same father. A second male, responsible for a small fraction of the litter, could theoretically have escaped detection, but the result made one explanation especially intriguing. A female whale shark may be capable of storing sperm after mating and using it to fertilize eggs over an extended period. That would explain how embryos apparently produced at different times could still share the same father. Sperm storage is known in other sharks, so the mechanism itself would not be unprecedented. What remains uncertain is exactly how whale sharks use it. One female and 29 genetically tested embryos cannot establish the reproductive strategy of an entire species. We do not know whether single paternity is typical. We do not know how long sperm can remain viable. We do not know whether females normally mate once between reproductive cycles or with several males. And the developmental differences inside the Taiwanese female have led to ideas about staggered fertilization or potentially extended production of young, but those possibilities should not be turned into a neat story of a mother deliberately releasing batches of pups over time. The evidence does not yet take us that far. What it does show is already remarkable enough. One mating may potentially allow a female to fertilize eggs over an extended period, and one pregnancy can involve an extraordinary number of developing young. More than 300 embryos sounds like a reproductive strategy built around abundance, especially for an animal famous for growing enormous. But those numbers need context. We do not know how many pups from such a pregnancy would ultimately be born successfully, how frequently females reproduce, or how many newborns survive their earliest months. Producing hundreds of embryos does not necessarily mean producing hundreds of adults. In a species that appears to grow slowly and mature relatively late, the path from a half-meter newborn to a mature whale shark is likely a severe biological filter. The Taiwanese embryos provide our clearest physical window into the beginning of that path. They ranged roughly from the low 40s to just over 60 centimeters in length, and other exceptionally small free-swimming whale sharks support the idea that birth occurs at around half a meter, though exact birth size is not known as a single fixed value. Imagine the scale change contained within one lifetime. An animal that may enter the ocean little longer than a human arm can eventually become a fish longer than a city bus. Yet finding those half-meter animals in the wild is extraordinarily difficult. This is where the reproductive story becomes almost paradoxical. We possess detailed measurements from hundreds of embryos inside one female. We have genetic information about their father. We know they hatched internally. Yet we still cannot confidently point to the places where whale sharks normally give birth. Reports of neonate-sized animals are scattered and rare. Some have come from offshore waters, some from fisheries, and some from chance encounters that were never part of a dedicated search for newborns. Scientists have tried to combine these fragments to see whether a hidden geographical pattern emerges. Recent work examining records of very small whale sharks found an intriguing association with regions containing permanent oxygen minimum zones. These are parts of the ocean where deeper water contains exceptionally little dissolved oxygen, sometimes beneath highly productive surface layers. One hypothesis is that such environments could offer useful conditions around birth. Productive upper waters might provide food, while oxygen-poor depths could restrict some potential predators. But there is an important competing possibility. The association might partly reflect where humans are capable of finding the pups. If low oxygen water prevents young whale sharks from spending much time at depth, they may remain closer to the surface and become easier to detect. A place where newborns are seen is not automatically a nursery. Marine biologists use that word more carefully than popular descriptions often do. A genuine nursery should show evidence that juveniles occur there more commonly than elsewhere, remain or return for meaningful periods, and use the habitat repeatedly across years. A few tiny sharks in one region are fascinating clues, but they are not enough to declare that the birthplace of the species has been found. That distinction matters because the temptation to solve the mystery is enormous. If researchers could identify consistent birthing habitat, they could begin protecting a stage of life that is almost completely missing from our current picture. But first they would need to find the females before birth, follow them reliably, and then document what happens. That is far harder than it sounds. The mature females most likely to provide those answers are among the least accessible whale sharks. Some of the largest females encountered around Darwin Island in the Galapagos have swollen abdomens and have been described as potentially pregnant, but appearance alone cannot confirm pregnancy. Ultrasound and other techniques can help investigate reproductive condition when researchers can get close enough. Yet the ocean does not provide the controlled access of a veterinary examination. A female can appear briefly, descend, travel offshore, and become effectively unreachable. The same problem surrounds mating. We know the anatomical mechanism because whale sharks share the basic internal fertilization system of other sharks, but direct observations of whale shark courtship and copulation are extraordinarily scarce. St. Helena in the South Atlantic has produced rare eyewitness accounts interpreted as mating and observations of behavior that may be associated with courtship, making the island particularly interesting for reproductive research. But even there, a few encounters cannot yet give us a complete mating season, courtship sequence, or reproductive map. We do not know whether whale sharks travel to particular breeding grounds, whether mating occurs opportunistically when mature animals meet, or whether there are multiple reproductive regions scattered through the tropical oceans. This uncertainty changes how we should think about the 1995 female. She was not simply an unusually pregnant shark. She was a biological archive recovered almost by accident. Inside one animal were answers to questions scientists had struggled with for decades, alongside new questions that still have not been resolved more than 30 years later. She established that the largest fish in the world gives birth to live young after embryos develop and hatch from retained egg cases. Her litter revealed extraordinary fecundity. Preserved embryos later allowed scientists to investigate paternity. Their DNA provided evidence consistent with sperm storage. Their different developmental stages raised questions about how fertilization is timed, and their size gave us one of our best windows into what a whale shark looks like before entering the open ocean. Then the evidence stops. We can reconstruct what happens inside the mother far better than we can describe the moment after the young leave her. There is no well-documented scene of hundreds of whale shark pups entering the sea that scientists can point to as the normal birth process. There is no famous bay where pregnant females reliably arrive each year and newborns appear around them. The most important transition in the species' life happens almost entirely outside human observation. Somewhere, a female gives birth. A young whale shark enters the water at perhaps half a meter long, already carrying the spotted pattern that will remain its identity for years to come. There is no mother swimming beside it, teaching it where to feed or where to hide. Like other sharks, it receives no prolonged parental care after birth. Whatever happens next must begin immediately. The tiny filter feeder has to find food, avoid predators, and survive an ocean in which almost everything about its body will change in scale. The animal we first met as an enormous shadow beneath a boat begins its life small enough to disappear for an entirely different reason. And somewhere between that scarcely observed beginning and the juvenile sharks arriving at coastal feeding grounds lies one of the most extraordinary growth stories in the sea. Somewhere between that half-meter newborn and the enormous animal moving through the open ocean, time becomes part of the whale shark's body. Growth is obvious in principle. A small shark eats, survives, and becomes larger. But measuring that process in an animal that may disappear for years is surprisingly difficult. You cannot simply watch a newborn grow into a 12-meter adult. Even when the same individual returns to a feeding ground, the change from one year to the next may be too small to judge accurately by eye. For decades, this left researchers with a basic question that should have been simple but was not. How old is a whale shark? Sharks do not carry the structures most commonly used to age bony fishes, such as otoliths. Instead, researchers can examine their vertebrae. As a shark grows, alternating bands are deposited within the vertebral centra, creating a record that can be counted somewhat like rings in a tree. The difficulty is that a band only becomes a clock if you know how often it forms. Early whale shark studies disagreed on exactly that point. One interpretation assumed that a growth band formed once each year. Another concluded that two could form annually. That difference sounds technical until you apply it to an animal with 40 bands. Under one interpretation, it could be around 40 years old. Under the other, around 20. Growth rates, age at maturity, Longevity and the speed at which a depleted population might recover all change with that single assumption. Researchers needed something independent of the vertebra itself, a date written into the skeleton that could tell them which interpretation was right. Remarkably, humans had already created it. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the United States, Soviet Union, and other nuclear powers conducted above-ground thermonuclear weapons tests. The explosions produced an abrupt increase in radioactive carbon-14 in the atmosphere. This so-called bomb radiocarbon did not remain in the air. Carbon dioxide exchanged with the ocean, the signal entered marine ecosystems and eventually moved through food webs. Animals alive during that period incorporated the changing carbon signature into growing tissues. Decades later, the Cold War had left scientists an accidental timestamp inside marine life. Researchers realized that if whale shark vertebral bands truly formed once per year, the carbon-14 pattern locked inside them should line up with the known rise of bomb radiocarbon through time. They tested vertebrae from two large whale sharks. A 9.9-meter mature male landed in Taiwan in 2005, and a 10-meter female landed in Pakistan in 2012. The bands suggested ages of 35 and 50 years. Tiny samples were then removed from specific parts of the vertebrae and analyzed for carbon-14. The chronology matched. The bands were consistent with annual formation, not two bands every year. A question about the life of the world's largest fish had been answered partly by nuclear weapons tests conducted decades before. The Pakistani female's vertebra contained 50 growth bands, giving the first validated age of about 50 years for a whale shark. That does not mean whale sharks live for exactly 50 years. It means this particular specimen had reached approximately that age, and nothing in the vertebra suggested growth band formation had stopped. Larger or older individuals may survive substantially longer. Longevity estimates extending toward a century or more have been proposed from growth models, but those are estimates rather than directly verified ages. The strongest evidence is more restrained and, in a way, more impressive. A 10-meter whale shark had already accumulated roughly half a century of life. That timescale changes how we see a large animal. A giant whale shark is not simply a juvenile made bigger. It is the product of decades in which almost everything had to keep going right. It had to find enough food through changing seasons, survive deep dives and migrations, avoid predators when young, escape fishing gear and ship strikes, and repeatedly navigate an ocean whose productive patches appear and disappear. Size becomes a record of survival, but growth does not proceed at the same rate forever. Young whale sharks can add substantial length, while the relative increase becomes slower as they become large. Measuring this in living animals has required researchers to combine the identification system we have already followed with increasingly precise underwater measurements. Visual estimates are unreliable when the subject is several meters long and underwater perspective distorts distance. Laser photogrammetry improved the situation by projecting two laser points a known distance apart onto a shark's body, providing a scale within the photograph. Stereo video systems can reconstruct measurements even more accurately. Pair that measurement with the animal's unique spot pattern, and researchers can recognize the same shark years later and measure it again. Early attempts showed just how slow the problem could be. Over intervals of only 1 to 3 years, the expected change was sometimes smaller than the measurement uncertainty. The shark was growing, but not quickly enough for the method to separate growth confidently from error. Ningaloo Reef provided the longer record researchers needed. By combining photo identification with stereo video measurements, scientists followed 54 individually recognizable whale sharks, some across as much as a decade. The results suggested that males and females may follow different growth trajectories. Males appeared to approach an average maximum size of roughly 8 to 9 meters, while the more limited female data were consistent with females continuing toward considerably larger sizes, around 14.5 meters on average in the model. The female estimate is less certain because mature females are precisely the animals rarely represented at Ningaloo, but the pattern fits observations elsewhere. The most spectacularly large whale sharks encountered around places such as the Galapagos are often female. Sexual maturity also arrives surprisingly late in the growth journey. For males, clasper development provides a visible indicator. As a juvenile matures, the claspers lengthen and become calcified enough to function during mating. Studies from different regions place the size at which about half of males are mature broadly around 8 to 9 meters, with one photogrammetry-based estimate from Mozambique at approximately 9.16 meters. Females remain much harder to assess because they lack an equally obvious external marker, and the scarcity of mature females at major aggregation sites makes the problem worse. This means a whale shark can already be one of the largest fishes a person will ever see and still not be reproductively mature. The same caution applies whenever we talk about maximum size. Whale sharks have attracted enormous historical claims, 20 meters, sometimes more, and the farther back we go, the harder many measurements are to verify. A shark seen beside a boat is easy to overestimate. A dead animal can be measured along the curve of its body rather than in a straight line. Stories become rounded upward as they are repeated. Reviews of marine megafauna records have therefore tried to separate impressive claims from specimens supported by more defensible measurements. One widely cited analysis regarded an 18.8-meter whale shark reported from the Arabian Sea off India as the largest reliably measured individual in the scientific record, while acknowledging other reports around 18 meters and the uncertainty surrounding some historical giants. Even that figure should not be interpreted as a biological ceiling. It tells us the largest size for which the authors considered the evidence sufficiently reliable, not the precise maximum the species can physically reach. More importantly, most whale sharks never approach that extraordinary extreme. The animals encountered at many feeding aggregations are far smaller. The distinction matters because the largest individual ever reported can distort our mental picture of the species just as easily as a juvenile aggregation can. A 12-meter female is already an exceptional animal, carrying decades of biological history. There is no need to inflate her to 20 meters to make that remarkable. And slow growth carries consequences beyond the fascination of age. A species that takes years or decades to reach maturity cannot rapidly replace adults that disappear. Losing a mature female is biologically different from losing an animal in a species that reproduces after 1 or 2 years. Her body represents years spent reaching reproductive size, followed by whatever poorly understood sequence of mating, sperm storage, gestation, and birth we have only begun to reconstruct. If adult survival falls, new generations cannot simply accelerate to compensate. This is why getting the clock right mattered so much. Misreading 2 vertebral bands as 1 year would make whale sharks appear to grow much faster than they really do. A faster-growing animal looks more resilient on paper. An annually deposited band reveals something more vulnerable, a long-lived giant built slowly. The bomb radiocarbon study itself cautioned that its sample was small and that precise maximum longevity remains uncertain. But its central result changed the foundation beneath every growth estimate that followed. Whale shark vertebrae could be read on an annual timescale, and at least one animal had carried 50 years of that record inside its skeleton. There is something almost unsettling about the chronology. A whale shark alive during the rise of atmospheric nuclear testing fed somewhere in the ocean. Carbon altered by events occurring thousands of kilometers away entered seawater, passed through living organisms, and eventually became incorporated into its vertebral tissue. The shark continued swimming. Governments signed treaties. Above-ground testing declined. The radioactive pulse in the environment changed. The shark kept growing, laying down another band, then another, preserving a chemical trace of human history without ever encountering the history itself. Decades later, that animal died, and scientists opened its vertebra to discover that the signal we had accidentally placed into the ocean could tell us how long it had been alive. The irony is difficult to miss. Human activity helped reveal the whale shark's age, and that age revealed how slowly the species can replace what human activity removes. Because a whale shark that reaches enormous size has not merely accomplished an extraordinary feat of growth, it has successfully passed through decades of an increasingly human ocean. By the time humans began changing the ocean around them, whale sharks had already been making these journeys for millions of years. For most of that history, an encounter between our species and theirs would have been brief. A huge spotted animal might appear beside a fishing boat, cross a reef edge or surface where plankton had gathered, then disappear again into water no one could follow. Coastal communities within the whale shark's range knew these animals long before zoologists formally named them, and different cultures developed their own names and relationships with them. But the scientific story usually begins in 1828, when a specimen was harpooned in Table Bay, South Africa. The Scottish physician and naturalist Andrew Smith examined the animal and recognized something unusual enough to describe scientifically. He initially named it Rhiniodon typus. The accepted name today is Rhincodon typus. Even the first specimen contained the contradiction that would follow the species for the next 2 centuries. An animal unmistakably shaped like a shark, yet so enormous and unusual that its place among sharks was not immediately obvious. Scientific description did not make the animal easy to study. A preserved bird can be compared with another specimen in a museum drawer. A whale shark can weigh tons, cross international boundaries, and disappear beneath kilometers of ocean. For generations, much of what scientists learned came from dead animals, individuals caught deliberately, landed by fisheries or occasionally stranded. The same problem that later made reproduction so mysterious shaped almost everything else. To examine the internal anatomy, vertebrae, stomach contents, or reproductive organs of the world's largest fish, researchers often depended on the moments when humans killed one, and in several parts of the whale shark's range, people had reasons to do exactly that. Whale sharks were targeted or retained in fisheries for meat, fins, and liver products. Their enormous livers contained oil that could be used locally, while meat and fins entered commercial markets. The Taiwanese fishery that produced the extraordinary pregnant female we encountered earlier was part of this history. The specimen that transformed our understanding of whale shark reproduction reached science because the animal had first reached a fish market. This makes the history of whale shark research uncomfortable but important. Some of our greatest insights into the species came from the same exploitation that conservation would later try to stop. By the late 20th century, the relationship was beginning to change. Whale sharks were becoming valuable for another reason. People wanted to see them alive. Predictable seasonal aggregations made something previously difficult suddenly possible. Instead of searching an entire tropical ocean for a roaming giant, operators could bring visitors to places where whale sharks reliably appeared to feed. Ningaloo Reef became one of the defining examples. Along Western Australia's coast, the seasonal arrival of whale sharks developed into a tightly managed wildlife tourism industry. Boats could search for sharks, swimmers could enter the water beside them, and an encounter that had once depended almost entirely on chance became something people would cross the world to experience. The same transformation occurred in different forms around Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, the Maldives, the Philippines, and other aggregation sites. The whale shark was moving from fishery catch to wildlife attraction, and that shift changed its economic value. A dead shark can be sold once. A living shark that returns to the same region can generate tourism income repeatedly across years. One recognizable animal may be encountered by thousands of visitors during its lifetime, while supporting boat crews, guides, accommodation, restaurants, and other local businesses. That does not automatically make tourism conservation, but it creates an economic reason for communities and governments to keep the animal alive. In some places, that change has been profound. The Philippines prohibited the capture and trade of whale sharks in 1998, after targeted fisheries had operated in parts of the country. Taiwan ended its commercial whale shark fishery in 2008. International protections also strengthened. The species was added to Appendix 2 of CITES in 2002, regulating international trade, and to Appendix 2 of the Convention on Migratory Species. The animal, once valued primarily as meat, fins, or oil increasingly became internationally recognized as a migratory species requiring cooperation across borders. Tourism accelerated the change because it brought humans closer to living whale sharks than ever before. That access produced more than money. It produced information. The photo identification system we followed earlier depends partly on people being in the water with cameras. A guide photographing the left side of a shark at Ningaloo, a researcher documenting an animal in the Maldives, and a tourist submitting a usable image from Mexico can all contribute to the history of an individual. Tourism boats can report sightings, help researchers locate animals, and create opportunities to deploy tags or collect photographs that would otherwise require expensive, dedicated expeditions. A species once known disproportionately from carcasses could increasingly be studied while swimming. But the transformation contained another contradiction. The closer humans came in order to appreciate and protect whale sharks, the easier it became to interfere with them. At a natural aggregation, a shark may be trying to exploit a brief concentration of food. Now place several boats around it. Add swimmers entering the water. Add propellers outside regulated interaction zones, cameras, people attempting to position themselves directly in the animal's path, and inexperienced visitors who may not understand how quickly a seemingly slow shark can move. The encounter that makes someone care about the species can also become another disturbance the shark has to negotiate. This is why major whale shark destinations developed codes of conduct. The details differ by location, but the logic is similar. Limit the number of people around an animal, maintain minimum distances, avoid touching it, stay away from the head and tail, control vessel approaches, and give the shark space to choose whether the encounter continues. These rules are not simply about protecting tourists from a large animal. They are about preserving the shark's ability to behave like a wild animal while humans enter its environment. The importance of that becomes obvious when people ignore them. Studies of whale shark tourism have documented avoidance responses when swimmers obstruct a shark's direction of travel, while repeated close approaches can increase the amount of disturbance occurring around feeding animals. A whale shark does not need to attack or flee dramatically for an interaction to matter. A small course change repeated many times is still a behavioral cost. The most complicated example comes from Oslob in the Philippines, where the relationship between humans and whale sharks changed in a way almost unlike anywhere else. Beginning in 2011, fishermen at Tanawan began provisioning whale sharks with food, and a tourism industry rapidly developed around the predictable encounters. Rather than waiting for a seasonal plankton bloom to bring sharks close to shore, people could create the attraction themselves. By 2018, reported annual visitation had risen above 500,000 tourists. For the local economy, the transformation was enormous. For researchers, Oslob became something else as well, a natural experiment in what happens when a highly mobile wild animal learns that humans represent a reliable source of food. The sharks learned quickly. Research showed that individuals with longer histories at Oslob began arriving around the time feeding boats appeared and became increasingly likely to display the vertical suction feeding behavior associated with provisioning. Some sharks altered their residency patterns dramatically. In one multi-year study, most identified individuals remained intermittent visitors, but 9 became year-round residents, behavior unlike the normal seasonal movements expected from a species following naturally fluctuating prey. Other work found that frequently provisioned sharks used different depths and experienced different temperature regimes from animals behaving more naturally. The food had not merely attracted the sharks. For at least some individuals, it had altered how they used their habitat. Yet this is where the story requires care. Provisioning at Oslob remains scientifically and socially contested. Researchers have documented conditioning, altered behavior, changes in residency, and serious problems with tourist crowding, but the long-term population consequences are harder to establish. Other scientists have argued that evidence is insufficient to claim that provisioning is causing lasting biological harm, and have emphasized the livelihoods and local conservation incentives created by the industry. Both parts matter, saying that behavior changes is supported by evidence. Saying that those changes inevitably produce a particular long-term population decline would go beyond what has been demonstrated. What is not difficult to demonstrate is how intense the human presence can become. In observations conducted between 2015 and 2017, researchers found people within 2 meters of a shark during 93% of surveys, despite interaction rules intended to maintain distance. Earlier work had also recorded high levels of non-compliance. Feeding sharks were less likely to show avoidance behavior, which sounds reassuring until another interpretation is considered. An animal focused on obtaining a predictable food reward may tolerate disturbances it would otherwise avoid. A whale shark remaining beside swimmers is not necessarily evidence that the interaction has no effect on it. Oslob therefore represents the extreme end of a question facing whale shark tourism everywhere. How close can we get before fascination begins changing the thing we came to see? There is no reason the answer must be that tourism is inherently harmful. Properly managed encounters can create livelihoods, fund research, produce enormous quantities of identification data, and turn an animal once hunted into something communities have a financial interest in protecting. A visitor who spends 40 minutes beside a whale shark may leave caring more about sharks than decades of conservation messaging could accomplish. But wildlife tourism only retains that value if the animal remains more important than the photograph. The moment swimmers crowd the head, boats repeatedly cut across the animal's path, people reach out to touch the skin, or operators manipulate behavior simply to guarantee an encounter, the relationship changes. The whale shark becomes less a wild animal being observed and more an experience being produced. And unlike many effects humans have on the species, this one can feel completely harmless while it is happening. The shark does not roar, charge, or cry out. It simply changes direction, dives, remains for food, becomes accustomed to boats, or leaves. That subtlety is why research matters so much. Human fascination has given scientists unprecedented access to living whale sharks. The cameras brought by visitors have identified individuals across decades. Tourism revenue has given living animals economic value. Protections have closed fisheries that once deliberately killed them. But the story did not move cleanly from exploitation to conservation. We stopped hunting whale sharks in many places and began pursuing them with boats instead. We learned to recognize individuals and then discovered that some returned carrying scars. We built industries around predictable aggregations, placing more vessels into precisely the waters where sharks come close to the surface to feed. And once researchers began comparing photographs of the same animals across years, the consequences of sharing that ocean with us became increasingly difficult to overlook. The scars were already there in the photographs. Once researchers began recognizing individual whale sharks across years, they were not only recording where an animal had traveled or how much it had grown, they were also building a record of what had happened to its body. Some sharks carried sections missing from their fins. Others had deep cuts, abrasions, or parallel wounds consistent with propeller blades. These were the survivors, the animals that had encountered something in the human ocean and lived long enough to be photographed afterward. The more troubling question concerned the sharks that never returned. A whale shark spends much of its life doing exactly what makes collision with a vessel possible. It travels slowly compared with a ship. It feeds near the surface. It moves through productive coastal waters where ports and human activity are concentrated. But it also crosses open ocean, intersected by major shipping routes. Satellite tracking has shown that whale sharks can spend almost half of their recorded time within roughly the upper 20 meters of the water column in some datasets, the same narrow layer occupied by the hulls of large ships. When researchers combined tracks from 348 whale sharks with global vessel movements, the overlap was extraordinary. More than 92% of the shark's horizontal space use overlapped with persistent traffic from large vessels, and almost half of their vertical space use fell within the depth zone considered vulnerable to collision. The world's largest fish and the machinery of global trade were repeatedly occupying the same water. A small boat can injure a whale shark and leave evidence behind. A propeller may cut the skin or damage a fin. A collision with a cargo ship is different. A vessel weighing tens of thousands of tons may strike an animal without its crew realizing anything has happened. If the shark is killed offshore, there may be no carcass washing onto a beach, no observer, and no official record. It can simply sink. This creates what researchers call cryptic mortality, deaths occurring largely outside human observation. In the Global Collision Study, the last known positions of some tracked sharks occurred disproportionately in busy shipping areas, and depth recording tags provided evidence consistent with sharks sinking after probable mortality events. That cannot establish a ship strike as the cause of every disappearance, but combined with documented collisions and the enormous spatial overlap, it suggests that vessel mortality may be considerably greater than confirmed reports imply. The irony is that this threat exists, partly because whale sharks are protected from something that was once far easier to see. Targeted fisheries historically killed them for meat, fins, and liver products, and fishing pressure contributed substantially to population declines. Many countries subsequently introduced protections, while international measures began following an animal that refuses to remain inside national borders. Whale sharks were listed under CITES Appendix 2 in 2002, bringing international trade under regulation, and they are now also listed under Appendix 1 of the Convention on Migratory Species. Major regional fisheries organizations have adopted measures prohibiting intentional setting on or retention of whale sharks in relevant tuna fisheries. Those protections matter, but a law preventing someone from deliberately catching a whale shark cannot prevent a container ship from unknowingly hitting one hundreds of kilometers offshore. Fishing has not disappeared from the story either. Whale sharks can still become bycatch, particularly where large fishing operations overlap with their feeding habitat. Their tendency to gather around concentrations of small fish creates a particularly dangerous coincidence with purse-seine fisheries targeting tuna. Whale sharks can become encircled when nets are set around schools associated with them, which is why regional fisheries rules increasingly prohibit intentional sets on the animals. Entanglement in fishing gear adds another risk, and because one individual may move between several countries and international waters, protection can change during a single journey. A shark does not recognize the point where one nation's legislation ends and another begins. This is where everything we learned about whale shark biology begins to matter at once. If the species matured rapidly, produced new generations frequently, and remained within small territories, local losses might be replaced relatively quickly. Whale sharks do almost the opposite. Their growth is slow. Maturity takes years, likely decades for some individuals. Large adults represent enormous investments of time. Reproduction remains poorly understood. Pregnant females are rarely encountered, and the places where most newborns enter the ocean are still unknown. Then add migrations spanning national boundaries and entire ocean regions. Removing an adult from that system does not simply reduce a count by one. A mature female struck by a ship may represent decades of survival and reproductive potential that cannot quickly be replaced. This vulnerability is reflected in the species' current conservation assessment. The whale shark is classified as endangered on the IUCN Red List. But estimating a global population trend for an animal this difficult to count is inherently complicated. Aggregations can rise or fall locally without necessarily mirroring every other population. Photo identification databases contain thousands of sharks, but disproportionately represent individuals visiting accessible locations. Satellite tags eventually stop transmitting. The offshore adults and newborns we struggled to locate earlier are also the animals most easily missed by population monitoring. Conservation, therefore, has to operate while part of the population remains statistically obscure. Climate change makes that problem even less static. Whale sharks do not simply inhabit warm water. Their movements are connected to the biological productivity within it. Temperature, currents, fronts, upwelling and plankton help determine where feeding becomes worthwhile. Change those systems, and the map of useful habitat can change with them. Plankton communities themselves are already expected to reorganize substantially as the oceans warm, with modeling projecting shifts in the distributions of hundreds of phytoplankton and zooplankton species. For an animal that follows temporary concentrations of tiny prey, the consequences are not simply that the water becomes warmer. The places where food appears, the timing of those events and the routes required to reach them can change. A recent global whale shark analysis made the implications much more specific. Researchers combined 15 years of satellite tracking from 348 individuals with climate models to ask where suitable whale shark habitat might move during this century. Their projections did not produce one simple poleward migration. Different ocean basins responded differently, but under higher emissions scenarios, some regions lost large areas of present core habitat, while new suitable areas appeared elsewhere, with distribution boundaries shifting by hundreds or even more than 1,000 kilometers. In some national waters, projected losses of core habitat exceeded 50% by 2100. That alone would be a major ecological change. Then the researchers placed shipping traffic over the future maps. In some regions, climate-driven redistribution moved suitable whale shark habitat into greater overlap with busy shipping routes. The threat was no longer climate change on one side and vessel strikes on another. One could intensify the other. This is why climate change should not be reduced to a generic statement that warmer oceans are bad for whale sharks. The real problem is spatial. A feeding region can become less productive. A seasonal aggregation may shift. A route that once carried sharks through relatively quiet water may lead them into an increasingly busy corridor. New habitat can emerge in a place with very different levels of fishing, tourism, or vessel traffic. The oceanic map the species evolved to navigate is being rearranged while the human map laid across it remains crowded with ships, nets, and national borders. Pollution adds another layer, although the evidence requires the same caution we have applied throughout this story. Whale sharks filter enormous volumes of seawater and feed on plankton and small organisms capable of interacting with marine debris and contaminants. Microplastics have been detected in whale shark-related feeding environments and investigated as a potential exposure pathway. But measuring exposure is not the same as demonstrating population-level harm. The stronger conservation case does not need speculation. Direct mortality from fishing and collisions, habitat redistribution, slow life history, and incomplete knowledge of reproduction already create a formidable problem. Protecting a famous aggregation is therefore necessary, but not sufficient. A marine protected area around a feeding site can reduce some local pressures, regulate tourism, and preserve habitat. But the same shark may leave that boundary days later, descend into deep water, cross an international shipping route, and eventually enter another country's jurisdiction. The biology demands conservation at several scales simultaneously. At aggregation sites, tourism rules can reduce crowding and dangerous vessel approaches. In fisheries, avoidance and release practices can reduce bycatch, and international agreements can prevent deliberate retention. Photo identification and tagging can continue revealing important habitats and migration corridors. In high-risk shipping areas, researchers have proposed targeted measures such as vessel speed reductions and route adjustments where whale shark density and ship traffic strongly overlap. Because collision risk is concentrated rather than uniform, changing vessel behavior in carefully identified hotspots may achieve far more than attempting to regulate every ship across an entire ocean. And then the sharks themselves move the problem again. Climate projections suggest tomorrow's hotspots may not remain where today's are. Monitoring cannot simply identify an important place once and assume it will remain important forever. Satellite tracking, photo identification, citizen observations, and oceanographic measurements become part of a moving conservation system, watching where the animals go as their environment changes around them. International cooperation becomes unavoidable for the same reason. A whale shark may be photographed in protected waters, cross a shipping corridor in international waters, enter a country's fishing zone, and later appear at an aggregation thousands of kilometers away. No single protected reef can contain that life. Perhaps this is the most important consequence of everything we have learned so far. The whale shark's vulnerability does not come from one fatal weakness. It comes from the collision between its entire biology and the modern ocean. It becomes enormous slowly. It matures late. We barely understand where reproduction happens. Its young disappear into habitats we have not identified. Adults travel extraordinary distances. The animal repeatedly returns to the surface because that is where some of its food is concentrated and where it can recover from deep dives, and the surface is increasingly crossed by vessels. Its migrations connect countries whose protections are not identical. Its feeding depends on biological events controlled by currents, temperature, and productivity that are themselves changing. Even successful conservation in one place can therefore protect only one moment in a life that may unfold across decades and thousands of kilometers. And that returns us to the strange problem that has followed the whale shark from the beginning. Humans can now identify an individual from the arrangement of spots behind its gills. We can record its depth from space. We can detect a nuclear signature inside its vertebrae and estimate how many decades it has survived. We can predict where suitable habitat may shift as the planet warms. Yet every one of those discoveries has also revealed another piece of the animal that remains outside our view. We know the feeding grounds because the sharks gather there. We know some migration routes because tags survive long enough to transmit them. We know something about reproduction because one pregnant female was caught in 1995. We know newborns exist, but scarcely know where to find them. And when a mature animal disappears into the open ocean, sometimes even the difference between migration and death can remain invisible. Protecting the world's largest fish therefore requires something unusual, making decisions not only around what we know, but around the enormous portions of its life we still cannot see. Making decisions around what we cannot see may sound like an unusual way to protect an animal that can grow longer than a bus, but that has been the contradiction running through the whale shark's entire story. Its size makes it conspicuous only when it happens to enter the small portion of the ocean available to us. Return to the surface now, to the kind of encounter with which this story began, and the animal looks exactly as it did before. The broad head moves through the water. The enormous mouth opens. Pale spots cross a dark back. The tail swings slowly from side to side. Nothing about the scene has physically changed. What has changed is what each part of it means. Those spots are no longer decoration. Somewhere in a database, the geometry behind the gills may already belong to an individual with a history. A photograph taken today might connect this shark to an encounter 5 years earlier, or reveal that it has returned to the same feeding ground after disappearing for another season. Across the western central Atlantic, photo identification has already linked individuals among aggregation sites separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, while also revealing that many sharks repeatedly return to familiar regions. In the Indian Ocean, an analysis of 1,724 identified individuals found only one photographed at more than one of 5 widely separated aggregation sites during the study period, despite genetic evidence suggesting broader connections within the population. That apparent contradiction is revealing. The sharks do not need to move directly between the places where researchers photograph them for genes to move through the population. The connections may happen somewhere else, perhaps later in life, perhaps through adults using habitats we rarely sample. The database can show where an animal has been seen. Genetics can reveal relationships that the photographs alone cannot explain. The mouth means something different too. At the beginning it seemed almost absurd. An opening enormous enough to look threatening, attached to an animal feeding on creatures so small that many are difficult to see individually. Now that mouth connects the shark to an entire moving ocean. Its meals depend on currents concentrating plankton, fishes releasing clouds of eggs, seasonal blooms and temporary fronts where productivity becomes dense enough to make filtering worthwhile. A whale shark appearing at the surface is therefore not simply an animal arriving at a place. It may be responding to an ecological event whose causes began far away. Change the current, shift the spawning season, or move the productive front, and the shark may move with it. Even its enormous body no longer represents size alone. A large adult may contain decades of survival. Vertebral bands have preserved years one after another, even recording the radiocarbon pulse created by nuclear testing during the 20th century. The giant in front of us has not merely grown large, it has remained alive long enough for history to accumulate inside it. And then there are the scars. A missing piece of fin or a line cut across the back may record a moment when this animal's life intersected with ours. A propeller, a vessel, fishing gear. A shark carrying such an injury is evidence of survival, but also of exposure. The animals killed far offshore may leave no photograph and no scar for us to interpret. We have become surprisingly skilled at reconstructing whale shark lives from traces precisely because continuous observation remains impossible. A satellite tag gives us depth and movement until it detaches. A photograph gives us identity whenever the shark happens to be photographed again. A tissue sample contains genetic information about ancestry and population structure. These methods do not produce the same kind of knowledge, and that is why combining them matters. Genetic work in the Western Indian Ocean, for example, found strong similarity between whale sharks sampled in the Saudi Arabian Red Sea and Tanzania, even though the sites are separated by roughly 4,500 kilometers, and direct movement between them had not been demonstrated by photo identification or tagging. One possibility is that genetic exchange occurs through parts of the life cycle we seldom observe, exactly the mature, oceanic phase that has remained so difficult to follow. Even seawater can contain part of the story. As animals move through the ocean, they leave microscopic biological material behind: cells, mucus, waste, and other fragments containing DNA. Environmental DNA, or eDNA, allows researchers to sample the water rather than the animal itself. In the Arabian Gulf, scientists recovered whale shark mitochondrial DNA directly from seawater collected around an aggregation, and found haplotype frequencies similar enough to tissue samples to place those sharks within a broader genetic context. The method cannot yet tell us that one particular sequence belongs to the individual swimming past a camera, and seawater DNA cannot replace photo identification or tagging. But it changes the idea of what an encounter can leave behind. A whale shark can disappear and still have briefly altered the genetic information suspended in the water through which it passed. Genomics is widening the view further. Instead of comparing only a handful of genetic markers, increasingly complete whale shark genomes give researchers a foundation for investigating population connectivity, evolutionary history, and reproductive biology at much finer resolution. A near-gap-free genome assembly published recently improved the representation of the species' chromosomes and identified the first Y-linked scaffolds, creating better tools for studying sex chromosomes and eventually questions connected to reproduction. None of this suddenly reveals where a pregnant female will give birth. It gives scientists more pieces with which to recognize relationships hidden behind the movements we cannot observe. And movement remains the frontier that refuses to become simple. Better satellite tags can record more of the vertical life beneath the surface. Longer deployments can expose seasonal routes that a few weeks of tracking would miss. Networks of acoustic receivers can recognize tagged animals returning through monitored regions. Cameras contributed by researchers, guides, and ordinary divers can turn an encounter years later into a re-sighting. One whale shark documented in East Kalimantan, Indonesia, by a citizen scientist was identified about 3.5 years later in Honda Bay in the Philippines. Satellite-tagged sharks from Honda Bay crossed toward Malaysian waters, with individuals later returning to the Philippines. A shark can therefore carry its story through several countries, while different pieces of that story are recorded by entirely different people and technologies. But there are limits technology has not erased. A tag still stops transmitting. A photograph still requires someone to encounter the animal. Environmental DNA tells us that biological material was present in sampled water, not where the shark went afterward. Genetics can reveal population connections without showing the actual journeys that created them, and the animals scientists most urgently want to follow remain among the hardest to reach. Mature females can move through oceanic habitats where research vessels rarely encounter them. The swollen abdomen of a large female may raise the possibility of pregnancy, but following that individual until birth is another problem entirely. A newborn appears somewhere else, perhaps hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, and unless someone happens to be there, the event leaves almost no observable trace. Even the extraordinary female carrying 304 embryos gave us the inside of the reproductive story without giving us its geography. We learned what was developing within her, but not where she would have gone to release those young. The same uncertainty extends downward. A whale shark disappearing beneath a boat may remain relatively close to the surface, or it may eventually descend hundreds of meters. Some dives exceed a kilometer. A few recorded excursions have approached 2. We can describe the depth and temperature recorded by an instrument, but often not what the shark encountered there. Was it following prey, navigating, moving between water masses, recovering from or preparing for another part of its journey? Different dives may have different purposes, and a depth trace cannot turn darkness into direct observation. This is where the whale shark becomes more interesting than the mystery we might invent for it. There is no need to pretend that every deep dive hides an unknown behavior, or that every mature female disappearing offshore is traveling toward a secret birthing ground. Science is more demanding than that. Sometimes the correct answer is that the animal left and we do not know what happened next. But those gaps are becoming increasingly precise. A century ago, almost the entire life was a gap. Now researchers can identify exactly which questions remain unanswered. Where do most mature females spend the periods between the rare encounters we record? Do important mating areas exist? And if so, what oceanographic conditions define them? Are there recurring birthing regions? Do newborn whale sharks concentrate in true nursery habitats, or disperse rapidly through the open ocean? How do their movements change between birth, juvenile feeding grounds, and adulthood? What are the purposes of the deepest dives? How connected are populations that appear separate when judged from photographs but connected when judged from genes? And how many whale sharks are actually alive when the places where we can count them represent only selected parts of the population? Future answers will probably not come from one miraculous technology. They will come from overlapping evidence. A photograph establishes identity. A satellite tag adds movement. A genetic sample adds ancestry and connectivity. Environmental DNA detects biological presence without requiring capture. Oceanographic satellites reveal temperature, currents, and productivity around the animal. International databases allow an observation made in one country to become useful years later in another. Eventually, the fragments begin overlapping enough that something resembling a life emerges, but it is still a reconstruction. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember as the shark in front of us begins to leave. From the surface, there is nothing dramatic about it. The animal turns slightly away. The spots remain visible for a while, then lose their sharpness as water gathers between the shark and the observer. The enormous body becomes an outline. The outline becomes a darker shape inside the blue. The tail is the last obvious movement, sweeping once, then again, carrying the shark beyond the distance at which individual markings can be distinguished. At the beginning of this story, that would have looked like nothing more than a whale shark swimming away. Now the disappearance contains possibilities grounded not in imagination, but in everything scientists have managed to measure. The shark may remain nearby and return to the same productive water tomorrow. It may descend hundreds of meters before coming back toward the warmth of the surface. It may leave the region when the food disappears and travel along a route extending through several countries. It may eventually cross an ocean basin. If the animal is a mature female, parts of that journey may belong to a reproductive cycle we still scarcely understand. If it is a juvenile, the same spot pattern may appear in a photograph years from now, attached to an animal several meters longer. We cannot know which future belongs to this particular shark simply by watching it disappear. That uncertainty is not a failure of the story, it is the story. Every advance in whale shark research has allowed us to see farther, and almost everyone has revealed that the animal's life extends farther still. Satellite tags showed that the surface giant also inhabits the deep. photo identification transformed anonymous encounters into individual histories, then revealed entire demographic groups missing from the places we study most. Genetics connected populations whose movements we had never directly witnessed. A pregnant female answered the question of how whale sharks develop while leaving the locations of mating and birth unresolved. Vertebrae gave us decades of age while reminding us how long an individual must survive to become enormous. The more complete our instruments become, the clearer the incompleteness of any single encounter appears. Eventually the outline is gone. Somewhere below is still the largest fish alive, but there is no longer anything at the surface to show where it is. That is how an animal weighing tons can remain hidden in the 21st century. Not because it is rare enough to become mythical, not because it possesses some unexplained ability to vanish, and not because science has failed to look. It is hidden because we meet it only at intersections, a feeding event, a reef, an island, a photograph, a satellite transmission, a genetic sample, a few extraordinary minutes beside a boat. The rest of its life continues between those intersections, inside an ocean vastly larger than our ability to watch it.